Hi everyone, welcome back to Radio Night Crime. Before you drift off, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. If you're enjoying the stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now let's relax and jump into tonight's case. Story 1. They are easily able to put the victim's vigilance to sleep, intimidate, and completely subordinate it to their will. Relationships with such a person can carry a serious threat to both mental and physical health. As a rule, the manipulator is looking for a victim full of life, ambition, and energy of a person, so that in his network often fall even the most intelligent, strong, and independent who simply break, becoming obedient and uncomplaining puppets. Australian stalker from Tinder, as he was nicknamed in the press, hunting for young successful beauties, which he first conquered with his charisma, intelligence, and appearance, and then turned their lives into a real nightmare. The man's name was Paul Lambert, and he was incredibly attractive, intelligent, seductive, and equally insane. He stalked his victims with manic persistence, tortured, intimidated, maimed, and prepared to kill. The only thing that stopped him was a bullet fired to kill. Early years of Paul Lambert's life. Paul Lambert, née Scales, was born in 1980 on the 10th of August in Brisbane, the largest city and capital of the state of Queensland, Australia. He was the youngest of two children in the family of Margaret and Oliver Scales, and was raised with his older sister, Dorothy. When the boy was not yet 5 years old, his parents divorced. His father left the family and practically stopped communicating with the heirs, although he helped his former wife financially. Soon the man remarried, and in his new marriage he had 2 more children, after which he began to visit Paul and Dorothy, only to congratulate him on his birthday or Christmas, and sometimes called them. The boy missed his father very much, and was very resentful of him for leaving and, as he thought, falling out of love with him and his sister. Already in junior high school, Paul began to have serious problems with behavior and discipline. He became almost uncontrollable, and could not control him, neither mother nor teachers. The child behaved aggressively towards other children, did not recognize any authority, was impulsive, irritable, and his mood was constantly changing. Concerned, Margaret decided to show her son to a specialist and turned for help to a child psychologist, who diagnosed the boy with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. However, the doctor at that time did not see it as anything terrible, concluding that the problem arose against the background of divorce of parents, and with time will pass by itself. Allegedly, Paul experienced his father's departure too painfully, which resulted in behavioral problems and difficulties with concentration. A psychologist at the time did not prescribe any medication for the child, believing he would soon outgrow his neurological behavioral disorder. However, as time passed, the situation only worsened. By the age of 10, the boy became uncontrollable, displaying aggression and unpredictability. His mother decided to seek help again, this time consulting a psychiatrist who not only diagnosed him with ADHD, but also identified several other mental health issues, including bipolar disorder and clear signs of dissociative identity disorder, DID, commonly known as multiple personality disorder. This condition means the patient's identity is fragmented, leading to the impression that multiple distinct personalities exist within one individual. The boy was prescribed receptor medications, which he was supposed to take under his mother's strict supervision. However, getting him to comply was nearly impossible. He actively avoided taking his medication, convinced he was healthy and had no issues. Nonetheless, while Paul was a child, managing him was easier. Margaret insisted on treatment that seemed to help, and for several years the problem was forgotten. Paul's mental health struggles did not affect his intelligence or academic abilities. He excelled in school, becoming the top student. He had a knack for the sciences, easily performing complex calculations in his head, and his teachers believed he would succeed in a scientific career. After graduating, he effortlessly enrolled in a prestigious Australian university, earning a master's degree in economics and finance. Upon graduation, he secured a position at the headquarters of a major company in Sydney, quickly rising to lead the finance department. In terms of relationships, Paul had a striking appearance from a young age, and it only became more captivating over time. With masculine features, large expressive eyes, and a strong physique, he made a great first impression. He had many admirers in school, eager to catch his attention. Paul was sociable, easily making friends, and often being the life of the party. His mental health issues produced an interesting side effect, a powerful charisma. Everyone considered him a good guy, reliable and respected by his colleagues. When a child of one of his coworkers was diagnosed with cancer, he personally initiated a fundraising effort, providing significant support to the family. As mentioned earlier, Paul was good at making friends and easily started relationships with girls, but they were always short-lived. Before long, he would reveal his true nature, scaring his partners away. His romances typically lasted only a few months, after which he would turn their lives into a nightmare, stalking them, threatening them, lying, manipulating their emotions, and instilling fear. This was just the tip of the iceberg. Notably, he always chose very attractive girls who matched his own model-like appearance. Paul had several favorite methods for manipulating his victims to keep them close. He was highly articulate and persuasive, constantly playing on their sympathy by fabricating terminal illnesses for himself and his loved ones, which made the girls feel guilty for leaving their sick boyfriend. Only his mother and sister truly understood what Paul was really like. While he was a child or a teenager, he was difficult but manageable. His mother insisted on therapy, but as an adult, he completely rejected treatment and psychiatric visits. He achieved his goals through blackmail and threats, with the most effective method being the threat of suicide. Between 2002 and 2016, 6 restraining orders were issued against Paul, forbidding him from contacting or approaching 6 different girlfriends from that period. He stalked each victim for an extended time, poisoning their lives and driving them to the brink of madness. For one of them, he even emigrated to another continent, but was deported and banned from entering the country after she reported him to the police. But let's go through this step by step. First love. While attending university, Paul met a girl named Samantha. They began a romantic relationship, but it didn't last long. He tried to control her every move, manipulating her, pressuring her, stalking her, and completely stripping her of the ability to make her own decisions. It all came to an end after graduation when Samantha stayed in Queensland while Paul, driven by career ambitions, moved to Sydney. Despite the turmoil in their relationship, they continued to stay in touch after their breakup. At the start of their romance, they were both young, and for each of them, it was their first love. Perhaps that's why Samantha hesitated to completely sever their ties. The former couple occasionally called each other, exchanged messages, and interacted on social media. Samantha had no idea about Paul's new relationships. He regularly texted her, saying he missed her, couldn't forget her, and hadn't met anyone better. This was, of course, a manipulation. But despite her previous experiences with him, Samantha believed he had changed for the better over the years apart, and that he truly loved her. Attempt to start a family in January 2014, nearly 10 years after their breakup, the couple rekindled their relationship. Just a month later, Paul proposed, and Samantha happily accepted. They got married on March 2nd of that year. However, the new husband's behavior became troubling just a few weeks into their marriage. Paul began losing control, unable to manage his emotions, and even the smallest things could set him off. He constantly exerted emotional pressure on Samantha, trying to dominate her will. When that didn't work, he resorted to physical violence. When Samantha attempted to leave her tyrant husband, he promised to see a specialist and undergo treatment. She believed him, but it turned out to be just another manipulation tactic. 6 months after their wedding, when tensions reached a breaking point, Samantha brought up the idea of divorce again. This time, Paul promised once more to seek help, but she no longer trusted him. He then suggested they take a trip together to sort out their feelings and think things over. Surprisingly, this idea seemed like a possible solution to Samantha, and she agreed to start planning the trip. In late September 2014, the couple traveled to the other side of the world, to the United States. Paul insisted on visiting Florida, a place he had long wanted to see. Although Samantha preferred Hawaii, she caved under the pressure from her manipulative husband, who always got his way. They renewed their wedding vows on the shores of the Atlantic Ocean. However, despite the romantic setting, the event, and the trip could not save their marriage. Hunting in Florida after returning to Australia, Paul insisted they move to Florida, where he had enjoyed his time. Samantha was adamantly against it. She had no intention of relocating to another country or continuing their relationship. Samantha insisted on a divorce, but Paul had no intention of granting it. During this time, he became obsessed with the idea of moving to the US, pushing everything else aside. He simply abandoned Samantha, quit his well-paying job, packed his things, and flew to the girl continued to seek an official divorce, but her husband ignored her efforts. Thanks to his solid savings from years at a big company, Paul was able to indulge himself after relocating to a new country. He rented a spacious apartment in a nice area, regularly hit the gym, bought expensive trendy clothes, and carefully maintained his appearance. Wherever he went, he drew the attention of women, but he was on the hunt for something special. The unfinished divorce Paul created profiles on several dating sites, showcasing his best photos. Almost immediately, numerous women began messaging him, admiring his looks, and eager to get to know him better. However, he took his time responding, until he stumbled upon the profile of Brittany, and this 32-year-old blonde was a local news anchor with a truly Hollywood appearance. Brittany caught Paul's attention right away, and he was the first to message her, suggesting they meet up. Without hesitation, she agreed, and they set a date just a day later. Paul charmed her with his charisma, eloquence, and good looks. He didn't just shower her with compliments. He took Brittany to one of the city's best restaurants. Paul made an unforgettable impression on her, so much so that she found herself falling for him on their first date. Brittany thought he was the man of her dreams, possessing all the best qualities, and she excitedly shared this with her best friend. However, Paul viewed her as a prize trophy, something he needed to boost his own ego. This woman was incredibly beautiful, a popular TV personality, and had immense career potential. Paul didn't want to lose her, so he made up some important business to justify flying back to Australia to finalize his divorce. He planned to return to the States right after and propose to Brittany. Samantha was taken aback by Paul's sudden visit, and even more shocked by his frantic desire to end their marriage, especially since he had previously refused to grant her a divorce. Nevertheless, by early 2015, without an official dissolution of their marriage, Paul flew back to Florida, unable to endure the separation from his new obsession. More accurately, he couldn't bear leaving her without his watchful eye. When Brittany accidentally discovered the real reason Paul had gone to Australia, she was shocked, and even considered breaking up with him, feeling guilty for the collapse of his marriage. However, Paul managed to convince her that he and his wife had long since separated, and that they had mutually decided to end their marriage. He just needed to settle some formalities. Upon his return, Paul immediately went to see Brittany, spinning a sob story about his unhappy first marriage and his search for true love. His words sounded so sincere that just a week later, the couple moved in together. However, Brittany laid down some ground rules, agreeing to give Paul a sort of trial period of 3 months. She believed that during this time, they could see if they were truly compatible. Beauty and the Beast after moving in, it took Paul just a month to reveal his true self and turn Brittany's life into a nightmare. He began to see her as his possession, believing he had the right to dictate her actions and completely control her life. His behavior became erratic, and his actions were unpredictable. It seemed he was battling multiple conflicting personalities within himself, which he couldn't control. Brittany quickly realized that something was seriously wrong with her new partner and tried to end the relationship. For Paul, this was a call to action. He started blaming her, claiming that he had divorced his wife and flown halfway around the world for her. He insisted he had sacrificed everything for her, and she was now destroying his life. He pushed for them to stick to their original plan of living together for at least 3 months, but Brittany packed her things and moved out to another apartment. Trying to escape her unstable boyfriend by moving didn't work. Paul began stalking Brittany, not leaving her alone for a moment. He sent her hundreds of messages daily, called from different numbers, emailed her, and literally followed her everywhere. The tone of his messages fluctuated between love declarations and pleas for forgiveness to threats of self-harm or harm against her. A couple of weeks later, Paul changed tactics. He called Brittany, his voice trembling, and told her that his father had died and he had no one to talk to in the U.S. Brittany's heart softened. She couldn't imagine anyone lying about something so serious. Being kind-hearted and empathetic, she agreed to meet her ex-boyfriend, genuinely wanting to support him, believing he needed to talk and vent. So, playing on her sympathy and manipulating her feelings, Paul managed to maintain a connection with Brittany for a while, making it seem like they were back together. However, he couldn't keep himself together. He became aggressive again, acting erratically and frightening her. When Brittany attempted to break up with him once more, he declared that he wouldn't survive another shock and threatened to harm himself. Brittany was frankly afraid of her inadequate boyfriend, but didn't know how to get rid of him. She gently suggested that he seek help from a psychiatrist, to which Paul replied that psychotherapy and medication will not help him, because he was diagnosed with an inoperable brain tumor, which is growing and is the cause of his breakdowns as well as strange behavior. The pathological liar cried, claiming he was going to die soon, and made the girlfriend promise that she wouldn't leave him while he was alive. The next month and a half turned out to be the most terrible in the life of the popular TV host, because Paul did not give her peace neither at home nor at work. The girl stopped sleeping normally, became anxious, distracted. She had panic attacks, which negatively affected her work and threatened to turn into a complete collapse of her career. Restraining order and deportation, unable to cope, Brittany simply ran away from Scales, staying with a friend where she thought he wouldn't bother her. But the man changed tactics and began to threaten the girl with the publication of her candid photos as well as an intimate video, which he filmed without her knowledge. This was the last straw, and the victim finally went to the police, which she also reported to her stalker. In July 2015, the court issued an order prohibiting the stalker from approaching the girl or having any contact with her in any way. But despite this, Paul continued to stalk his victim, writing her threats, blackmailing her, following her. In October of the same year, the man was finally deported from the country, banning him from entering the United States, and Kill was able to breathe a sigh of relief. Back in Australia, Scales, first of all, changed his name to Lambert, his mother's maiden name, so that no one would know about his problems with the law, and then he decided to return his ex-wife, with whom he never had time to divorce. Samantha was horrified to learn of Paul's return and went to the police to ask them to protect her and speed up the process of dissolution of the marriage. First attempted murder in February 2016, Paul called his wife and told her that he agreed to give her a divorce, and after convincing her to go to a lawyer together to settle some nuances. Samantha, despite the fact that she knew this dangerous man well, believed him and was already anticipating how she would receive the long-awaited certificate of divorce. The man picked up the girl in his car, and at first everything went normally, but as soon as they drove away from her house, he first began to beg to give up the divorce and live together again, and, having received a confident refusal, began to insult Samantha and threatened that he would smash the car so that they died together. Paul accelerated the car to a huge speed and almost flew under the truck, moving on the oncoming lane. The girl managed to twist the steering wheel and they drove off the road. Then the man began to beat his wife, but she managed to run out of the cabin and began to call for help. After the incident, Samantha went to court, accusing Paul of kidnapping, bodily harm, and attempted murder. He was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to 10 months in prison, as well as promptly dissolved the marriage and forbidden to approach his ex-wife. Surprisingly, just a month later, the man was released on parole with a probationary period of 1 year. Once free, Paul went to another state, rented a house there, and got a job but did not notify the authorities. However, every time, in order to check in with the inspector, he flew to the same place so that no one guessed anything. By the way, Lambert was obliged to visit a psychiatrist, who found him to have much deeper problems than previously thought. He was prescribed medication, which he, of course, did not take. After attending the number of sessions prescribed by the court, the man refused the specialist's help. A new victim almost immediately after his release, Paul started a new profile on a dating site, where he soon noticed 28-year-old Angela J., who fascinated him with her attractive, one could say, angelic appearance. It was his type, a graceful, blue-eyed blonde with a dazzling smile and an impeccable figure. The girl worked as a doctor and not so long ago went through a difficult divorce. So she was looking for support and understanding, and found a man who almost took her life. However, everything began beautifully and romantically. Paul again turned on all his charm, so that the new victim fell into his net. He showered Angela with compliments, took her on dates, seemed attentive, understanding, and sympathetic. After about a month, Lambert's behavior began to change rapidly. He became more and more obsessive and literally followed the girl. Secretly, he made a duplicate key to her house and would come there while Jay was at work. When she guessed about his visits, she decided to break off the relationship, and then, as you can guess, the worst began. Paul first begged her to forgive him and give him another chance. Then he threatened to take his own life, and when he realized it wasn't working, he started threatening Angela. Eventually, he asked her for help as a doctor, and she couldn't refuse. The girl promised that she would help him find a good specialist, and she herself would monitor the course of treatment, which the man seemed quite satisfied. Lambert behaved more and more inadequately and threateningly. He stole J's documents and refused to give them back to her, insisting that she go with him. But the girl realized how dangerous it was and therefore did not make a mistake. She managed to call her sister, who called the police. Paul returned the documents but was given a warning and then was simply released. Cut him up and tried to burn him alive. That same day, straight from the police station, Paul went to a hardware store where he bought a large kitchen knife, a roll of duct tape, and lighter fluid. Then he rented an inconspicuous car and drove to Angela's house. But he couldn't get in because the girl had changed the locks. He waited for her return from work, lurking near the front door. The girl saw her stalker at the last moment, managed to run into the house, close herself, and called the police. The law enforcers who arrived failed to apprehend Paul because he had escaped by that time. However, he returned a week later on November 3rd, taking with him a crowbar, which he used to open the back door, and broke into Jay's home while she was at work. When the unsuspecting girl returned, she had barely had time to cross the threshold before she felt a stabbing pain in her shoulder. Angela tried to run, but Paul knocked her down and began stabbing her indiscriminately all over her body. She received more than a dozen stab wounds in the chest and neck area. Her arms were shredded, but the girl continued to fight for her life. Suddenly, the man took out a bottle of lighter fluid and doused the victim, and then took a lighter, which fortunately turned out to be faulty. All the while, Jay continued to scream and call for help. Her desperate cries were overheard by a neighbor who was passing by the house, and he bravely rushed to the rescue, armed with the first stick he could find. He managed to scare off the attacker, who ran away. The man immediately called an ambulance and clamped the bleeding wounds of the girl until the arrival of the medics. Shot like a rabid animal, despite extensive injuries and heavy blood loss, the victim was saved. Surprisingly, Paul continued to write and call on Angela's phone, even when she was taken to the hospital. He apologized, blamed everything on his alter ego, and promised to get even. The man sent similar messages to his mother, as well as his ex-wife and Jay's parents. On November 4th, Lambert called the police and spent several minutes talking about the personalities living inside him, accusing them of all the atrocities. To offers to surrender, he replied that he would rather die, and hung up. However, the police managed to trace the call, and they went on the trail of the criminal. Paul was caught the next morning on a highway off the east coast of Australia and ordered to stop, but he tried to get away from the patrol cars at breakneck speed. Spikes were placed on the road, thanks to which the fugitive's car was stopped. However, Lambert was not going to give up and jumped out, waving a huge knife. To all entreaties to surrender, the man again replied that he would rather die. He behaved aggressively and inadequately, ready to attack the officers who already had him in their sights. At one point, Paul swung a knife and ran at one of the police officers, who was forced to shoot, but one bullet did not stop the intruder. Then several more shots rang out, after which Lambert fell to the pavement and did not move again. Only death could stop the madman. Story 2. Sweet, tender feelings can quickly turn into frustration, disappointment, and even outright hatred. In those cases, the most reasonable thing to do is end the relationship. If not as friends, then at least not as enemies. But when large sums of money and the chance to get rich fast enter the picture, at the cost of an ex-lover's life, an unsuspecting person's fate could be sealed. Gary Bentley's case is hardly unique. People have been killed for far less, but in this instance, the killer was hoping to pocket $1 million and secure a life of ease and comfort. Did Gary himself sense what might happen? His parents think he did. They had a bad feeling and were worried about him, trying to protect him. But Gary couldn't fully believe that the love of his life, the mother of his child, was actually capable of murder. He fought hard to save his crumbling marriage for the sake of his son. But in the end, he ended up in the grave, and the boy was left an orphan, even though his mother was still alive. So, what do we know about Gary Bentley and his early life? Gary Lewis Bentley was born on August 31, 1984, in a small rural town called Louisville, located in Jefferson County, Kentucky. He was the youngest of 2 kids born to Gerald and Lisa Bentley. Gary grew up with his older sister Amy, and they had a close, trusting relationship from an early age. The Bentley family ran their own farm and worked hard to make sure their kids had everything they needed, including a good education. The kids pitched in, too, and didn't shy away from the hard physical work that came with running a farm. The whole family was tight-knit, caring for each other and always offering support. From a young age, Gary spent a lot of time with his dad, Gerald. They were very close, often going fishing, hunting, and camping together. His dad taught him how to handle a gun, shared survival skills like how to navigate the wilderness, and showed him where to find edible mushrooms and berries. As a teenager, Gary developed a serious interest in firearms. He knew how to handle them and eventually started collecting guns. Nearly every weekend, he and his dad would go hunting or fishing, and they were best friends. Gary was the definition of a small-town guy, a real handyman who could build or fix just about anything. People around him would describe him as kind-hearted, easygoing, and always willing to help anyone in need. Gary did well in school, stayed away from bad influences, didn't have any bad habits, and never got into trouble with the law. He was a quiet, homebody type of kid who always put his family first. After high school, Gary went to college in the state capital, Frankfurt, where he majored in engineering. After graduating, he moved back to his hometown of Louisville, starting out as a basic electrician, but he quickly worked his way up the ladder. While in college, Gary met a girl named Tasha, who became the love of his life. She was about 1.5 years older than him, but the small age gap didn't bother them at all. They started dating pretty quickly and, in 2006, moved in together, settling not far from Gary's parents' home. Tasha was studying to be a nurse and, after getting her degree, landed a job at one of the city's hospitals, where she quickly earned the respect and admiration of her coworkers. She didn't stop there, though. She decided to continue her education and kept working to advance her career. In 2012, Gary and Tasha finally made it official, throwing a big wedding and inviting all their family and friends. Soon after, Tasha got pregnant, and the couple was overjoyed. In the spring of 2013, they welcomed a baby boy and named him Connor. By the time their first child was born, both Gary and Tasha's careers were thriving. They were making good money and were able to move into a bigger, more comfortable home, buy 2 cars, travel, and basically live without worrying about money. Gary dreamed of having a big family and wanted at least 2 more kids with Tasha, but things started to fall apart just a few years later. The first 4 years of their marriage were perfect. People saw them as a model couple. They had respected, well-paying jobs, were amazing parents, good friends, and gracious hosts. The couple often threw parties at their home, inviting family and close friends. They were always the first to step up if someone needed help or support. Gary's parents, Gerald and Lisa, couldn't have been happier with their daughter-in-law and grandson. But in 2016, things started to change rapidly. The Bentley marriage hit a rough patch, and their relationship began to deteriorate. It all started when Tasha began having problems at work, something that had never happened before. She constantly complained about her coworkers, her boss, and the unbearable working conditions. Gary did his best to support her, but he advised her not to quit too quickly, since finding another job with a good salary wouldn't be easy. In the fall of 2016, trying to take a break and relieve some stress, the couple decided to go on vacation. They left their son with Gary's parents and flew to a resort. They went to Jamaica with their longtime friends, Annie and Kevin Day, who they had been close with for years. The first few days of the trip were perfect. They all had fun, relaxed on the beach, explored the island, and enjoyed each other's company. But Tasha seemed distracted, like her mind was somewhere else. She was constantly texting someone, and got very defensive if anyone asked her who she was talking to. The longer they stayed on the island, the more Gary and Tasha started arguing. According to their friends, the fights seemed to come out of nowhere and quickly escalated into full-blown arguments, which made Annie and Kevin uncomfortable. One day, during a yacht trip, Gary and Tasha got into yet another argument, and to ease the tension, Kevin tried to make a joke. In response, Gary splashed beer in his face. Kevin didn't take it too personally, understanding that Gary's reaction wasn't really about the joke, but more about the stress caused by Tasha. Gary, feeling embarrassed afterward, apologized several times, admitting he didn't know what came over him. Shortly after they returned home from vacation, Tasha told Gary she had quit her job. Gary wasn't happy about her decision, since losing such a good income could hurt their family's financial situation. However, being a responsible and frugal person, he had some savings that could help them get by and maintain their lifestyle until she found another job. But just a day after quitting, Tasha was hired as a consultant at a big pharmaceutical company. This was odd, because she hadn't mentioned finding a job before quitting. It seemed like someone might have helped her land the position, but Tasha brushed it off as pure luck, saying she stumbled across the interview by chance. Although Tasha seemed happy with her new job, things didn't get better at home. She was rarely around, stopped cooking, didn't take care of the house, and showed little interest in what was going on with Gary. She even neglected their son, leaving most of the parenting to his grandparents. On the weekends, Mrs. Bentley started leaving town, saying she had work trips. She was constantly on the phone with someone, always finding a private spot, so no one could overhear the conversation. When asked, she insisted it was work-related and that she needed to discuss things with her colleagues or bosses. She also put a password on her phone, something she had never done before, so no one could check it. She became secretive and distant. Gary, on the other hand, was the one taking care of their son, pouring all his love and attention into him. He practically lived for the boy, spending all his free time with him and doing everything possible to make sure he didn't feel neglected. Despite the constant fights and his wife's indifference, Gary still loved her and hoped to save their marriage, if only for their child's sake. Family trip to Mexico. Gary's parents, seeing the tension building in their son's family, decided to surprise him, Tasha, and their grandson with a trip to one of the most beautiful resorts in Mexico. They chose a cozy hotel in a secluded area, hoping it would give them a peaceful environment to reconnect and spend quality time together. There wasn't much cell service there, and the internet was weak and often cut out. This allowed the family to enjoy each other's company, hang out at the beach, and take long walks. However, Tasha was visibly frustrated by the lack of connectivity. She was always trying to make phone calls or find a signal to send messages. She got angry, lashing out at Gary and his parents, even yelling at their young son. Gary's dad, Gerald, found her behavior strange and decided to have an honest talk with his son. He shared his suspicion that Tasha might be having an affair. Gary tried to laugh it off, but from the look in his eyes, Gerald could tell his son had the same thoughts but was trying to pretend everything was fine. The couple argued every day, and Tasha demanded they cut the vacation short and return home, citing some urgent work matters. Eventually, she packed her bags and announced she would fly back alone. This forced the rest of the family to leave early with her, even though their stay at the hotel was paid for another week, and they didn't get any refunds. A strange string of fires. In the spring of 2017, Tasha called her father-in-law, Gerald, sounding distressed. She asked him to come help her and pick her up. She explained that her car had caught fire at a gas station and was completely destroyed. She needed to go to her insurance company and then head back home. Of course, Gerald rushed to help her, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. This was the third time in the years she had been with Gary that one of her cars had mysteriously burned up. Each time, it happened at a gas station, and the car was reduced to nothing but scrap metal, making it impossible to determine the real cause of the fire. Every time, the incidents were blamed on faulty gas station equipment, and Tasha always received hefty insurance payouts. These fires happened about every 3 years, and Tasha would insure the cars for the maximum amount just before the fires occurred, always using different insurance companies. She claimed to have no idea how it happened, and some friends and family even thought she might have enemies who were purposely sabotaging her cars. Still, after each accident, Tasha bought a newer, more expensive car. The insurance companies had no grounds to deny her claims, even though the fires followed a suspicious pattern. Proving deliberate property damage was next to impossible. The not-so-secret affair by the summer of 2017, Tasha was disappearing almost every weekend, explaining it as work trips. She became more distant from Gary and their son, living what seemed like a separate life. Friends, family, and even the Bentley's neighbors began to suspect that Tasha was having an affair. These rumors hit Gary hard. He stopped trying to joke about it and would either stay quiet or quickly change the subject. Gary's parents tried several times to talk to him, telling him that things couldn't go on like this since, essentially, the marriage had already fallen apart. But Gary always responded the same way. He still loved his wife and was determined to keep the family together for Connor's sake. He held on to the hope that Tasha would come to her senses, reconsider her priorities, and that things would go back to the way they were. In November 2017, Gary, Tasha, and their son went to his parents' house to celebrate Thanksgiving. Gary's sister Amy also came with her family. When everyone started exchanging gifts, it turned out that Tasha hadn't bought any, saying she was too busy with work. She apologized and left, promising to fix it and return soon. She was gone for hours, but came back empty-handed, without buying anything, not even for her son. When everyone gave her confused looks, she claimed the lines everywhere were too long, and it would have taken her all night to get through them. This time, Amy couldn't hold back. She pulled Gary aside and asked him point-blank if he realized that Tasha was probably seeing someone else and wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. Gary simply responded that they would handle it themselves. A gun safe in the bedroom. The following weekend, Gary called his dad and asked him to come over and bring some tools. Gerald was happy to help and showed up at his son's house within half an hour with everything needed. As mentioned earlier, Gary had been collecting guns since his youth, and his house was filled with pistols, hunting rifles, shotguns, and more. He even had some rare items scattered across different rooms. But now, Gary suddenly decided to install a safe in his house, gather up all his firearms, and lock them away. This sudden decision worried Gerald a little, so he asked Gary why he suddenly wanted to hide his gun collection. Gary didn't give a clear answer, but Gerald could tell his son was afraid of something, and it didn't seem like he was worried about burglars. Later, when Tasha got home, she explained that it was her idea because she was scared and felt like they might be in danger. Her words seemed strange, but at the time, Gerald didn't think much of it. Only a few days remained before the tragedy. The mysterious murder at home on Sunday, December 10th, 2017, Tasha called her father-in-law, telling him she hadn't been able to reach Gary all day, and when she got home, the garage door was open. She was too scared to go inside, worried that burglars might have broken in, and asked Gerald to come over. Thankfully, Connor was safe, staying with his grandparents, and Gary was home alone. Gerald rushed over as fast as he could. At first glance, nothing seemed out of place. The garage door was indeed ajar, but there were no signs of forced entry. Inside the house, everything looked normal, nothing appeared to be missing, and there were no indications of an intruder. Gerald called out to his son several times, but there was no response. When he walked into the bedroom, he found Gary's lifeless body lying on the bed. In shock, Gerald tried to perform CPR, but Gary's body was already cold, showing signs of rigor mortis. He immediately called 911, still unable to believe his son was gone. It wasn't until later that he noticed the gun safe in the bedroom had been broken into and some of the firearms were missing. The forensic findings when the forensic team arrived They determined that Gary had been killed by a single gunshot to the head, fired at close range. Since he was lying on his side in bed, in a sleeping position, and had no other injuries or signs of a struggle, it was likely that he was asleep and didn't even hear the killer approach. The crime didn't look like a typical robbery. Valuables, a jewelry box, and even cash left in plain sight were untouched. This indicated that the main target was the gun safe. However, only a few guns were taken, none of which were particularly valuable. Neither these nor the guns that remained were the murder weapon. The main suspect from the start of the investigation, Gary's wife Tasha, was the primary suspect. For one, she didn't seem like a grieving widow. She calmly spoke with the detectives, detailing the day's events leading up to when she and her father-in-law found the body. Second, all of the couple's friends and family confirmed that Gary and Tasha's marriage had been on the rocks for a while, and they were close to divorce. Third, the Bentleys had 2 large dogs that barked at anyone but their owners. Yet the neighbors hadn't heard any barking, and Gary would have likely woken up from the noise if they had. Tasha claimed that Gary had planned to go hunting that day, and she had left the house to run some errands. She said that she tried to call him after lunch, but she hadn't been able to get through. Not too concerned, she chalked it up to bad reception. On her way home, she stopped by a friend's house, which her friends confirmed when questioned. There were no witnesses to the crime. No one heard anything suspicious or saw any strangers that day. Even surveillance footage from nearby cameras yielded no useful clues. The crime appears to have been a carefully planned crime, unsuccessfully staged as a robbery. Annie Day, one of Tasha's friends, called her to offer her condolences and ask if she could help with funeral arrangements. Tasha's response stunned Annie. She said that Gary's parents were handling the funeral because she had more important things to take care of. Those more important things turned out to be a trip to the insurance company for a large payout. Apparently, shortly before the murder, Tasha had convinced Gary to take out $1 million life insurance policy. Gary, in an effort to please his wife, agreed, although he wasn't thrilled about it. A few days before the crime, Tasha tried to increase the payout to $2 million, but she failed. Now there was a clear motive. However, there was still no hard evidence linking Tasha to the murder. At the same time, details surfaced about her 3 previous burned-out cars, each of which had resulted in large insurance payouts. It became clear that Tasha had pulled similar insurance tricks before. One of Tasha's friends said that Tasha had been dating a coworker named Anthony for over a year, and he was the one who helped her get a new job. Investigators decided to question Anthony about his involvement in the crime, suspecting that he may have helped his lover. Anthony admitted that he had a long-standing romantic relationship with Tasha and revealed that they met regularly at his home. He claimed that Tasha was planning to leave Gary, and they even planned to celebrate New Year's Eve 2018 together. When Anthony realized that he was being considered as a suspect in the murder investigation, he rushed to provide an alibi. He stated that on the day of the murder, he was at his parents' house helping them with renovations. They made several trips to thrift stores that day, all of which were captured on surveillance cameras. Detectives concluded that Tasha had likely acted alone, which explained why there were no signs of a break-in and why the dogs hadn't barked. But the murder weapon and the missing guns from the safe remained a mystery. Tasha kept changing her story, adding new details, and sometimes trying to shift the blame onto others. She even brought up the conflict between Gary and Kevin Day during their vacation when Gary threw beer in his friend's face. According to Tasha, Kevin might have held a grudge and used this as an opportunity for revenge. However, a few hours into her interrogation, Tasha finally cracked and confessed. She admitted to killing her husband, but blamed Gary for what happened. Tasha claimed that Gary was abusive both to her and their son, and that on the day of the murder, he had once again hit their child. She said that was the last straw, and after waiting for Gary to fall asleep, she grabbed a gun. However, none of Tasha's claims were backed up. None of Tasha's friends or family supported her claims. In fact, everyone stood by Gary, saying he was a devoted, loving husband and the most caring father they had ever known. They insisted he would never lay a hand on his wife, let alone their young son, whom he adored. Even the child confirmed that his dad had never hurt him or his mom. Tasha eventually revealed the hiding spot where she had stashed the guns taken from the safe, including the murder weapon, a pistol. Interestingly, the gun had Anthony's fingerprints on it. As it turned out, Tasha had given the gun to her lover to hold, leaving his prints behind. Her plan was to frame him if things didn't go as expected, but she confessed before she could put that part of the plan into action. Trial and sentencing. The trial for Gary's murder began in June 2021. According to the prosecution, the primary motive for the crime was money. Tasha hoped to collect the $1 million insurance payout and planned to use part of that money to renovate Anthony's house, where she intended to move in the near future. On July 20, 2021, Tasha Bentley was found guilty of premeditated murder and attempting to mislead the investigation. She was sentenced to 55 years in prison, with the possibility of parole no earlier than 2037. As for little Connor, who lost both his father and mother in one tragic moment, he is now being raised by his paternal grandparents. This crime was featured on an episode of Investigation Discovery titled American Monster. Story 3. Have you ever wondered how a single wrong decision, one innocent action, could lead to a tragic event? Imagine a couple going kayaking on one of the most dangerous days of the year. It was supposed to be just another adventure, but it ended in such a shocking way that I still can't wrap my head around the story. Folks, where do you think the line is between truth and mistake? How can one small action or word change everything? Will you be able to make up your own mind about the story? Or will it leave you questioning every detail? Stay with me because the most intriguing parts are yet to come. When everything falls apart in an instant, every action you take can turn against you. A single word, spoken in a moment of shock, can become a weapon in the hands of justice. Angelica's story is an example of how an unexpected chain of events can change a life forever. The Hudson Valley is an idyllic spot for outdoor adventures. The stunning nature and swift river draw in those who crave a thrill. Kayaking is a favorite sport for risk-takers, but the river can be merciless. Experienced athletes know this, but sometimes even they aren't immune to mistakes. Angelica Grawald and Vincent Viafor loved the water. To them, it was a symbol of freedom and closeness. On that fateful evening of April 19, 2015, they set out on the Hudson once again, full of excitement. Both were used to challenges and had years of experience behind them. But that day, the Hudson was not on their side. The rising winds stirred up powerful waves, and despite their instincts telling them to turn back, they decided to push forward. Their destination was an island with a castle inspired by Scottish traditions, a place that drew them every time with its mystery and ancient atmosphere. They spent the day enjoying nature, but when evening came, the situation took a sudden turn. The strong waves and icy waters were an ominous sign, but they had no choice but to head back. Staying on the island without gear for an overnight stay was just too risky. When Vincent's kayak began to take on water, the situation took a tragic turn. Without a life jacket and in the cold water, Vincent found himself in a critical situation. Angelica, overwhelmed by shock, called the emergency services. In desperation, she explained that she couldn't reach him due to the powerful waves, and that the current was pulling him further away. The dispatcher struggled to pinpoint the couple's location, further complicating the situation. Time was slipping away, and every second counted. Vincent was already slipping under the water when rescuers set out to find him, but by the time they reached the area, it was too late. Vincent was nowhere to be seen from the shore. The darkening sky only added to the somber mood of the event. Let's learn a bit more about Angelica. At 35, Angelica was a woman with serious ambitions. She was pursuing photography and saw it as her future. However, her real name was Angelica Lips. Originally from Latvia, she sought a better life beyond her homeland. 2 marriages, 2 divorces, but her goal remained the same. She wanted to settle in the US, obtain a work visa, and build a career. She got lucky. She landed a job as a nanny and moved to the States. But the real changes began when she met Vincent. At 46, Vincent had been through 2 divorces and was successful in the construction business. Despite the age gap, their relationship progressed quickly. Now let's take a closer look at Vincent. Vincent was a generous person. He hosted parties, gathered friends, and led a lively and active life. It was at one of these gatherings that he and Angelica met. Just a few weeks later, she moved into his home in a small town called Poughkeepsie, New York. Their relationship moved fast. Talks about marriage and children became a regular topic. But beneath the surface, there were issues brewing, which only intensified the day before the tragic event. On April 18, 2015, just a day before the accident, Vincent and Angelica went to another party. Vincent was having a good time with his friends, but Angelica left early, claiming she wasn't feeling well. She barely interacted with others and seemed distant. Vincent's friends noticed the tension between them, which escalated into a minor but noticeable disagreement. However, nothing significant happened that evening. They went their separate ways that night, reuniting only the following morning. That's when Vincent shared his plans for kayaking. He was determined for them to patch things up and head out on the Hudson River to spend some quality time together. Let's go back to that tragic day. Despite the cold weather and increasing wind, Angelica agreed to the idea. The couple planned to visit Bannerman's castle, located on an island in the middle of the river, for a photo session. Angelica brought along elegant outfits for various shots, hoping to capture some great images. By noon, they were at the water's edge, ready for another adventure. But the wind, which was growing stronger, seemed to foreshadow trouble. Massive waves rose around them, and the cold made every movement stiff. Angelica noticed the worsening weather, but Vincent's love for adrenaline and his stubbornness pushed them to continue. Before setting off, Vincent said something that Angelica would never forget. "This will be the adventure of your life." Those words would take on a new, haunting meaning just hours later. The journey to the castle went smoothly. Angelica told the police that they had shared a couple of beers before setting off, just to set the mood. They both knew they needed to stay sober, given they had to make their way back. But despite this, everything changed on the way back. Vincent started to fall behind as the waves grew taller. He shouted that his kayak was taking on water. Angelica turned around and saw his vessel sinking. She tried to turn back, but the tidal current pushed her toward the shore. Once she reached land, she called emergency services. But by that time, Vincent had already disappeared into the cold waters of the Hudson River. The evening of April 19, 2015, marked the beginning of a search that lasted through the night and into the next day. Divers plunged into the murky waters of the Hudson, searching for Vincent's body, while a sonar-equipped boat battled fog and rough waves. Rescue helicopters scoured the area, but all efforts were unsuccessful. Vincent's family was in a state of shock and panic, struggling to cope with the tragedy. His loved ones and friends held onto a sliver of hope that somehow he had managed to survive, despite the freezing water and strong current. Yet even they knew the odds were slim. Paradoxically, among all the concerned people, Angelica appeared the calmest. She continued to update her social media, posting photos and videos as if nothing had happened. This behavior deeply upset Vincent's family, who felt her actions were inappropriate and even suspicious. She claimed she was holding on to hope, waiting for her fiancé to return, but her words did not resonate with the grieving relatives. 10 days after Vincent's disappearance, Angelica found herself back at the police station for another round of questioning. It was all due to a seemingly offhand comment she had made during her initial conversation with detectives. She mentioned that she might have accidentally removed the drain plug from Vincent's kayak on the way back. This small detail drastically shifted the course of the investigation. Suddenly, there were more questions than answers, and the theory that Vincent's death was simply an accident started to seem less likely. In addition, Angelica told the detectives that Vincent's paddle was also damaged. It had lost a locking ring, which made it difficult to row properly. This only heightened the detectives' suspicions, leading them to consider the possibility of foul play, a broken paddle, and a missing plug. These details troubled investigators. Combined, these small elements gave the police reason to suspect that Angelica may have intentionally set things up for Vincent to drown. But what would have driven her to do this? The motive remained a mystery, and without it, the entire picture felt incomplete. To shed light on her possible motives, investigators started reaching out to people who knew both Angelica and Vincent. The police contacted Angelica's ex-boyfriend, Michael Coven, whom she had lived with several years earlier. Michael was shocked when he learned about the suspicions surrounding Angelica, but admitted he couldn't completely rule out such an outcome. He revealed that beneath her calm and composed exterior was a darker side. During certain moments, particularly when they had been drinking, Angelica could become confrontational and start arguments, something Vincent, according to Michael, tolerated quietly. However, just a couple of weeks before the tragedy, Vincent confided to a friend that he was seriously questioning whether he should marry her. He described her as manipulative and aggressive, especially when she lost control. During questioning, Angelica admitted that there were indeed conflicts in the relationship, but claimed they were solely related to their personal life. Her ambiguous statements and vague language made the detectives suspicious. More and more details pointed to the possibility that Vincent's death was not an accident, but a carefully planned tragedy. The motive turned out to be more significant than initially expected. Beyond relationship issues and anger, Angelica had a specific financial incentive. She was the primary beneficiary of Vincent's life insurance policy, valued at approximately $500,000. It was a large sum that could solve her financial problems and offer her a fresh start. At the time, Angelica was unemployed, and this money could drastically change her future. These new revelations shifted Angelica from the role of grieving fiancée to the prime suspect. Despite this, she continued to insist on her innocence. However, the prosecution charged her with second-degree criminal wrongdoing, and she was detained with a bail set at $9 million, an amount she could hardly afford. Given her foreign nationality, investigators feared she might attempt to flee. So, Angelica remained in custody awaiting trial. Angelica's defense argued that the statements she made during the 11-hour interrogation were not legally binding. Her attorney insisted that Vincent's body had still not been recovered, and that without forensic evidence, it was impossible to confirm any foul play or intentional wrongdoing. He argued that Vincent's death was a tragic accident. According to him, the kayak capsized due to a wave, and the drain plug might have come loose later when the vessel started sinking. To support their version of events, the defense organized an experiment on the Hudson River. A person with a similar build to Vincent sat in a kayak of the same model. The tests revealed that the vessel was sitting extremely low in the water, just a few inches above the surface, even on a calm day. This demonstrated that large waves could easily fill the kayak with water, even if the plug hadn't been dislodged. Additionally, the attorney reminded everyone that Vincent had been under the influence of alcohol, which could have impaired his coordination and reaction time. A flooded kayak, questionable confessions, and experiments on the water, all of this sparked intense debate. Vincent's body was still missing, but the investigation was gaining momentum. The main point of contention was the drain plug, a tiny opening no bigger than a fingertip. It was hard to believe that such a small detail could have caused such a tragedy. The drain opening on Vincent's kayak was located on top, making it unlikely that it could have let in enough water to cause the vessel to sink. Doubts continued to grow, and Angelica's lawyer insisted on further experiments to shed light on this mystery. An exact simulation was conducted, the same type of kayak, a mannequin matching Vincent's weight and size, and conditions that closely mirrored those of that ill-fated day. The experiments showed that even with the drain plug removed, the kayak didn't fill with water quickly enough to cause it to capsize. The drain hole allowed only a small amount of water to trickle in, just drops that wouldn't have been enough to cause a fatal incident. This meant that even without the plug, Vincent's kayak could have easily made the remaining distance of about a mile or so back to shore. However, when the experiments seemed to completely disprove the theory about the plug, the prosecution shifted focus to the paddle. According to Angelica, the paddle was damaged, missing the locking ring, which investigators believed could have hindered Vincent's ability to control the kayak. But even here, the defense didn't back down. They demonstrated that the absence of the ring didn't affect the paddle's functionality. It remained sturdy, could be used effectively, and was fully operational. However, this didn't change the fact that during her interrogation, Angelica admitted to touching both Vincent's paddle and the plug, an admission that became the catalyst for the charges against her. To the police, all of this looked like a carefully planned crime. Even the smallest details, such as touching the paddle or accidentally brushing against the plug, were turned into grounds to suspect Angelica of deliberate actions. Yet, despite the prosecution's seemingly logical narrative, the defense continued to fight. Angelica's attorney argued that her statements had been extracted under emotional duress during the interrogation. The defense brought in a false confessions expert who reviewed all 11 hours of the recorded questioning and concluded that the police had applied substantial psychological pressure. The expert claimed that the detectives used classic tactics designed to coerce a confession. They asked leading questions, played the roles of the good cop and the bad cop, didn't allow her time to process the situation, and pressured her into repeating phrases that suited their narrative. During the interrogation, Angelica often became confused, her responses grew vague, and her emotions increasingly unstable. The expert argued that she was in a state of shock, and her words should have been treated with caution. One phrase that the detectives latched onto, her fleeting remark about having once thought about being free from the relationship, was interpreted as an admission of intent to harm Vincent. In reality, the defense claimed this statement had no direct connection to the events of that day. It was merely a reference to their long-standing relationship issues. Angelica spoke about freedom in a broader sense, but the police chose to interpret her words differently. The interrogation expert noted that Angelica never used words like crime or even death in that context, and her admissions were more a result of manipulation by the investigators than the actual truth. The detectives, however, disregarded these details. Once they heard what they wanted, they dismissed any further statements Angelica made. The defense argued that Vincent's kayak had been having issues long before that fateful day. The drain plug had been faulty for months. According to Angelica, they had without the plug several times, and it never caused any serious problems. The conditions on the river that day were dangerous, but it was the weather, not any intentional actions, that led to the tragedy. Nevertheless, the prosecution remained firm in their stance. To them, it all fit together: a woman tired of the relationship, seeking financial gain, staging an accident to collect insurance money and gain freedom. Angelica's interrogation felt endless. She had lost track of time and felt cornered. At first, she tried to hold her ground, but when the police repeatedly circled back to the issue of the drain plug, her resolve weakened. Her story about the plug, whether it was there or not, became muddled, creating confusion that the investigators chose to exploit. The turning point came when a worn-down Angelica asked to leave so she could feed her cat at home. Tears welled up in her eyes, and that was the moment the detectives had been waiting for. They sensed her vulnerability and intensified the pressure. A barrage of leading questions came her way, and although she never directly confessed to a crime, the police refused to relent. An expert who later reviewed the interrogation footage noted that Angelica appeared exhausted, overwhelmed, and clearly not in a state to think clearly. Her inconsistent responses were the typical result of emotional fatigue, not a conscious admission of guilt. According to the expert, she simply wanted to escape the never-ending questioning, which led her to give several unclear answers that formed the basis of the case against her. Meanwhile, Vincent's body remained missing. His family and friends were left in limbo, with their pain growing each day. It wasn't until the morning of May 23, 2015, nearly a month after he had disappeared, that a boater finally discovered his body in the Hudson River, near the same Bannerman's Island the couple had visited on the day of the tragedy. The autopsy confirmed that the cause of death was drowning. There were no signs of foul play or struggle. Vincent's blood contained traces of alcohol, but not at a significant level, suggesting that he was mainly impacted by the harsh weather conditions and the frigid water temperature. Vincent's kayak was recovered a few days after the body was found. The drain plug was missing, and the paddle, as suspected, lacked the locking ring. Yet, the absence of the ring did not affect its functionality. The defense insisted that none of these factors alone could have led to drowning. It was the combination of circumstances: the cold water, strong winds, the lack of a life jacket, and the presence of alcohol. It was this combination that caused the tragedy, not any actions taken by Angelica. But the prosecution wasn't backing down. They focused on the inconsistencies in Angelica's statements, seeing them as evidence of her involvement in Vincent's death. Their theory was straightforward. She intentionally tampered with the kayak to create a situation where Vincent wouldn't survive. However, Angelica's lawyer insisted it was an unfortunate accident caused by Vincent's own recklessness. He chose to go out on the water while under the influence without a life jacket and in poor weather conditions. He knew the chances of surviving in the freezing water were slim, but he still took that risk. Despite Angelica maintaining her innocence, the case took a turn when the prosecution realized that pursuing a charge of intentional harm wouldn't hold. Pulling out a drain plug or breaking a paddle were complicated ways to commit a crime, and it wasn't enough to convince a jury. Furthermore, the defense's arguments were compelling, and experts confirmed that such a tragedy could indeed happen under those circumstances. At an impasse, the prosecution offered Angelica a plea deal. They proposed she plead guilty to involuntary manslaughter, which would result in just a few years in prison instead of a life sentence. She agreed. Angelica was sentenced to 4 years of imprisonment for involuntary manslaughter. However, considering the time she had already served while awaiting trial and during the court process, she had only a few months left to serve. Angelica was released on parole in December 2017, having spent 32 months in custody, less than 4 years. As part of the plea deal, she was technically sentenced to 4 years, but due to time served and early release, she ended up serving less than half that time. So, while her sentence was officially 4 years, the parole system allowed her to gain freedom earlier, in late 2017. Even after her release, tensions remained high. Vincent's family couldn't come to terms with the outcome. They believed Angelica was responsible for their son's death, and were vocal about their dissatisfaction with the leniency of the sentence. Angelica, on the other hand, maintained that only she and God knew the truth. She continued to assert that she wasn't responsible for Vincent's death, and that it had been a tragic accident. After her release, she faced new challenges. Deportation loomed, and she struggled to find employment. Angelica attempted to claim Vincent's insurance benefits, but her guilty plea made that impossible. 16 months later, she was forced to return to her home country, where she began to rebuild her life. Leaving the nightmare of those events behind, she enrolled in a university, found a job, and continued to move forward, claiming she had fully recovered from the ordeal. Folks, there are a lot of questions in this story that we might never get clear answers to. Vincent's death, Angelica's behavior, and the conflicting testimonies. All of these create a complex and emotionally charged picture. It's easy to get swayed by public opinion or the prosecution's narrative in such situations, but it's important to remember the truth isn't always obvious. Personally, I believe that the justice system, especially in cases like this, can make mistakes. Interrogation tactics, pressure, and psychological exhaustion, these can all lead to false confessions. Angelica found herself in a situation where not only the circumstances, but also her own missteps in words and actions worked against her. But was she truly responsible for Vincent's death? Or was it just a tragic accident that spiraled into a nightmare for everyone involved? Now, I want to turn to you, the viewers. What do you think weighs heavier in this story, guilt or chance? Is Angelica a victim of a judicial error? Or is she truly connected to Vincent's death? What would you have done in her place? And most importantly, can we always trust conclusions drawn from conflicting evidence? I'm eager to hear your thoughts. This is the kind of story that makes you question the fine line between truth and accusation. Story 4. Every 7th crime on Earth happens within families, and over 38% of these are committed by men. Moreover, domestic violence is most prevalent in developed countries. Approximately 33 to 50% of all women who die violent deaths are killed by their husbands or partners, highlighting the critical need to protect women from domestic crimes. But why does a woman's desire for a strong man by her side sometimes lead her straight into the hands of a monster? Maybe it's because some are willing to have that strong shoulder at any cost. After all, society and family teach us that a woman needs a man by her side. We're raised that way, and then some women end up enduring violence. This happened in 2012. Ekaterina Gurieva was just 26 years old, and her killer is already out of prison and back in Izhevsk. Let's dive into a new story. Izhevsk is a large industrial city in the Russian Federation and is a scientific, educational, and cultural center of the Volga region. Located west of the Ural Mountains, this capital of Udmurtia is renowned for its weapons manufacturing and engineering industries. When visiting, one can admire the city's architecture, experience Udmurt culture, and explore the famous Izmash Museum. Back in her hometown, Ekaterina Gurieva's life wasn't going great. She had gone through a tough divorce, had no prospects, and was raising a young child alone. Feeling drained and defeated, she decided to start over. She moved with her daughter from Naborozni Chelny to Izhevsk, a new city, new experiences, new people. The change brought color back into her life. Ekaterina found work she loved, established herself in the beauty industry, and even had plans to open her own salon. Things were going well, except her personal life wasn't coming together. Despite her striking looks and constant attention from men, Ekaterina wasn't in a hurry to trust anyone. She avoided dating and threw herself into her work, until Alexei Tatarkin appeared in her life. They first met in 2007. Alexei worked as a taxi driver. Being noticed by such an attractive woman as Katia was flattering for him, so he turned up the charm. He told Ekaterina that driving a taxi was just a side gig and that by day, he was a system administrator for several major companies, with 2 degrees in system administration and economics. By this time, Ekaterina was standing on her own 2 feet and didn't need financial support. But the fact that he was educated and seemed ambitious intrigued her. For a while, they kept things strictly friendly. Then, when her ex-husband's business needed a system administrator, Ekaterina thought of Alexei. He got the job, and from that moment, Alexei started to be more involved in her life, driving her and her child to daycare, fixing her computer, walking her dog, and even taking her to visit her parents back in Naborozni Chelny. But even with all this attention from Alexei, Katia saw it as just a friend helping out. So he decided to change his tactics to win her heart. He began to play on her sympathy. One day, Alexei put on quite a show outside the office where Ekaterina worked. He was in tears, telling her he'd caught his wife with another man, and that his wife's aunt had even told him that the kids he thought were his weren't. Even though the whole scene seemed pretty ridiculous, Katia felt empathy for him and offered her support. Alexei kept pulling the sympathy card, claiming that he'd served in Chechnya, was wounded in the head there, and that sometimes he'd go to the funerals of his fallen comrades. The hardships of his life touched something in Ekaterina's heart, and she couldn't just leave him alone. But he finally won her over when he went to Moscow for surgery to remove a bullet supposedly lodged in his head. Alexei called her from the train station, saying he had passed out and someone had stolen his money and documents. The compassionate Katia rushed to help him, brought him home, and took care of him for an entire week. It was after this incident that they started dating. Unfortunately, only a fraction of what Alexei had told her was true. The rest was a complete fabrication. But at the time, Ekaterina, smitten and unaware, couldn't see through the lies. Relationships built on deception rarely have a future, and problems in their relationship began almost immediately. Once, Alexei took the last 1,000 rubles from Ekaterina's purse just to buy her roses. He didn't seem to care that she was left with no money to even buy food for herself and her child. As time went on, Alexei started persuading Katia to move in together, and after much persistence, she finally agreed. But another surprise awaited her. Alexei suggested they get married. He applied to the registry office 3 times, but Ekaterina kept refusing. Once again, he resorted to dramatic gestures. Alexei Tatarkin would twist his arms in despair, saying he had no one else in the world, and if she turned him down again, he'd end his life. Ekaterina finally gave in, and on August 30th, 2011, their marriage was officially registered. Ekaterina's mother didn't like Alexei from the start. She found him unreliable and felt he wasn't a good match for her daughter. Several times over the phone, she even asked him not to pressure Katia if she wasn't ready to get married. But then one day, she got a call from her daughter. "Mom, I don't know how to say this. We got married." She tried to lighten the mood by joking, Maybe getting divorced the second time won't be as scary as the first. After the wedding, their life together didn't get any better. They kept arguing about money. Just 2 months after they were married, Alexei Tatarkin started getting heavily involved in Ekaterina's business affairs. He sold the KAMAZ trucks she got as part of the property division from her first marriage. With the money, they took a trip to Moscow and bought 3 used foreign cars to fix up and resell later. But in the end, they only got paid for 2 of the cars, and the money for the third seemed to vanish into thin air. Alexei insisted that he'd been scammed, but Ekaterina wasn't buying it anymore. She demanded that he either return the money or give her a car of equal value. Eventually, he wrote her a promissory note for 400,000 rubles, which Katya took to her mother and asked her to keep, just in case. It's worth noting that Ekaterina worked incredibly hard to support the family. She had an extremely busy schedule, sometimes taking on 10 to 12 clients a day and staying at work until as late as 1 a.m. She was paying off the car loan, covering daycare expenses, buying clothes for herself, her daughter, and her new husband, paying for gas, car parts, her advanced training courses, and other daily expenses. But whenever Katya tried to talk to Alexei about finances, she'd end up facing another jealous outburst from him, complete with accusations about her living an inappropriate lifestyle. She often told her friends and her that she was going to get a divorce and admitted the marriage had been a mistake. But getting Alexei Tatarkin to leave her apartment was nearly impossible. By mid-February 2012, they finally separated. But their arguments continued. Ekaterina Gurova filed for divorce, and just a few days later, she disappeared. On May 27, 2012, Ekaterina Gurova, a well-known beauty expert in Izhevsk, was reported missing. On May 28th, Ekaterina's mother decided to call Alexei. She didn't like him and didn't want to reach out, but Ekaterina hadn't answered her phone since the night before and hadn't called back, something that had never happened before. Alexei calmly said he didn't know where Katya was and even promised to check her apartment. But her mother knew Alexei Tatarkin wasn't telling the whole truth. That same day, she managed to find the number of her daughter's friend and reached out to her. From Naberezhny Chelny, she called local morgues and hospitals and filed a missing person report with the police. The moment she heard the news, Ekaterina's mother rushed to Izhevsk. The apartment her daughter had been renting was locked and her car was still parked in the courtyard. From that moment on, one of the largest search operations in the city's history began. Katya's friends tried to piece together what might have happened on the day she vanished. According to them, around 2 p.m. she was seen sitting in a cafe with a man. This information supposedly came from one of the waitresses. Afterward, Katya drove home in her car. Security cameras near her building showed that around 3:40 p.m., she parked in the courtyard and went inside. What happened next remains a mystery. Her car stayed in the parking lot, but Katya disappeared without a trace. Katya's mother mentioned that she tried calling her around 6 p.m. The phone rang, but Katya didn't answer. By 11 p.m., her phone was turned off and no one could reach her. Her loved ones insisted that Katya would never just leave town without telling anyone, even if it was for a short trip. On May 30th, 2012, the investigative department of the Pervomaysky district in Izhevsk, under the Investigative Committee of the Russian Federation for the Udmurt Republic, launched a criminal case under Part 1 of Article 105 of the Russian Criminal Code crime concerning Ekaterina Gurova's mysterious disappearance. The Investigative Committee of the Russian Federation for the Udmurt Republic took special control over the investigation. The search continued, and even a month later, Ekaterina was still nowhere to be found. The entire city of Izhevsk was searching for Ekaterina. Flyers with her photo were posted everywhere. Her friends even reached out to psychics for help. Dozens of volunteers, including her friends, acquaintances, and clients, teamed up with the police to search for her. They combed through the suburbs and different parts of the city based on tips from witnesses, but there were still no leads. Despite the tireless efforts of the police and volunteers, no progress was made. So Ekaterina's mother, Olga Gurova, filed complaints with every possible agency in Udmurtia, the Republic's prosecutor, and even reached out to the President of Russia, Vladimir Putin. She received replies from all the offices stating that her letters had been registered. Only after this did the investigators start showing some renewed interest in the case. Ekaterina's husband was a prime suspect. He had been extremely jealous, and Ekaterina believed he was behind the disappearance of her documents right before their divorce. However, Alexei swore he had nothing to do with Katia's disappearance and claimed he didn't know anything. Right after she went missing, he was detained, questioned, and then released. Alexei then withdrew from the world, turned off his phone, and refused to communicate with anyone. The search continued. Proving Alexei Tatarkin's involvement in Katia's disappearance wasn't easy. The break came thanks to a waitress who'd withdrawn money from Katia's request. When she saw the missing person posters a few days later, she contacted Katia's mother. Additionally, testimony from a neighbor helped the case. The neighbor had heard a scream coming from Katia's apartment. Other witnesses reported seeing Alexei driving Katia's car on the day she disappeared. The police seized the car, and during the investigation, they found traces of Ekaterina's blood inside. The forensic results came back in early July. By July 10th, Alexei Tatarkin was arrested. He kept insisting he had nothing to do with his wife's disappearance. He would put on a show during questioning, claiming he felt unwell, and we had to call an ambulance, recalled Yevgeny Fedorov, the lead investigator for high-priority cases with the Investigative Committee of the Russian Federation for Udmurtia. But the doctors couldn't find anything wrong with him, and there was no documented proof that he'd had a minor stroke, as he claimed. On July 12th, during yet another interrogation, he suddenly confessed to killing his wife. Alexei said he confessed because he was terrified. According to him, Ekaterina had been appearing to him in his dreams every night, talking to him and driving him insane. His confession came as a tragic gift on the eve of what would have been her birthday. On July 13th, the murdered Ekaterina Gurova would have turned 27. But even after confessing, he continued to mislead the investigation. One moment he claimed he committed the crime on the banks of the Kama River, and the next he couldn't remember where he hid the remains. There were many odd details in the case of the young woman's disappearance, but the painstaking work of investigators helped piece together the sequence of events leading up to the crime against Ekaterina Gurova. The last person to see Katia alive was one of her students, Alina. They met at a cafe around 2 or 3 p.m. on May 27th. She wanted to open a beauty salon, Alina recalled. She wanted to hire me. We had just started talking when Katia's phone rang. From what I understood, the caller told her that someone had posted her personal messages online. Katia tried to check the internet on her phone, but couldn't access anything. She said she was going home and would be back in about 30 minutes. She asked me to wait for her, the witness said. On her way home, Katia called her husband. They were already in the process of getting a divorce, and she suspected he was the one who had posted her messages, as he was very tech-savvy. She arranged to meet him at the building on Udmurtskaya Street, 161, where she'd been renting an apartment for the past 2 months after they'd separated. According to Alexei Tatarkin, they met in the building's entryway, and an argument broke out almost immediately. Katia accused him of leaking her personal messages with another man. In response, Alexei launched into accusations of his own. I asked my wife if the rumors I'd heard about her seeing other men were true. Her response basically implied I'd be an idiot not to have figured it out by now, Alexei told investigators. Without thinking, I grabbed a knife and stabbed Katia in the chest. After the stab, Katia collapsed to the floor. Caught her. I sat there on the floor with Katia lying on my knees. I stayed like that for about 10 minutes, and then she stopped showing signs of life. When I came to my senses, I realized I had taken her life. I took the knife and began dismembering the body to cover my tracks. A neighbor of Ekaterina's reported hearing a woman's scream that lasted about 5 minutes. It sounded muffled at times, as if someone was covering her mouth. Afterward, the sound of running water could be heard in the bathroom for several hours. What Alexei Tatarkin did next was far from the behavior of someone acting in a blind rage. It seemed like everything he did was carefully calculated to create a perfect alibi. He didn't call an ambulance or attempt to save his wife. Instead, he cold-bloodedly dismembered her body into 9 pieces and packed them into garbage bags. Afterward, he sent 2 text messages from Katia's phone to his own, one saying she had gone for a drive and another saying she'd call him the next day. That same evening, He used her laptop to send messages pretending to be her, further throwing the investigation off track. Around 9 p.m., he took the bags outside and loaded them into a car he had received from a client for repairs the day before. He buried some of the remains near the village of Chultim and left the rest at a landfill near the village of Volzhoy in the Zavyalovsky district. After that, he calmly went home and continued watching as the entire city searched for the woman he had already buried. The official funeral for Ekaterina Gurova took place on July 17, 2012. She was laid to rest in a closed casket. First, a memorial service was held for her in Izhevsk, and then the hearse transported her coffin to Nabережny Chelny. Katia's family chose to bury her next to her father's grave. Many of her father's former colleagues came to say their goodbyes to Ekaterina and shared stories about how much he had adored his Katiunya. Valery Gurov had worked for many years as an anesthesiologist at the perinatal center, but in October 2008, at just 45 years old, he passed away suddenly from cancer. Ekaterina left behind a 6-year-old daughter named Nastya. So why did her husband decide to confess to the crime a month and a half later? Katia's mother, Olga Gurova, suspected that even his confession was part of a calculated plan. She believed he waited just long enough so that the remains wouldn't be able to reveal exactly how the crime had been committed. There's plenty of information online about how, where, and at what rate a human body decomposes. It's possible that Alexei Tatarkin timed everything and only revealed the body when it was too late to determine how many wounds he inflicted or the exact way he attacked Katia. And what about the motive? Was it really just jealousy, or were there other reasons? If we go back to the beginning of their relationship, it's clear that their biggest fights were always about money. And indeed, Alexei Tatarkin had a complicated relationship with money. For example, according to Olga Gurova, Katia would give him the money to make monthly payments on her car loan. But starting in May 2011, those payments stopped. Meanwhile, Alexei kept promising Katia that he would soon pay off the loan entirely. Even during the investigation, he continued to insist that he'd been making regular payments out of his own pocket and that he'd given all the receipts to Katia. But in November 2011, a collection agency that had purchased the debt from the bank called a number listed in their database, which turned out to be Alexei's. He told them that his wife had been in a car accident, was in the hospital and couldn't speak, but promised they would start paying off the loan soon. He managed to drag this out until May 2012. After Katia's death, he told them that now he was the one in the hospital. Money issues were at the root of most of the major arguments in their relationship. Katia was unhappy with the fact that Alexei didn't have a steady source of income, but seemed to have endless expenses for what he claimed were business ventures. Gurova and Tatarkin were complete opposites. She was open and honest, while he was cunning and greedy. And to top it off, he was extremely jealous. To be fair, there was some basis for Tatarkin's jealousy. During the trial, Alexei's friends testified that he had repeatedly asked them to spy on his wife. During one of these stakeouts, they caught Ekaterina flirting with another man. Moreover, with his background as a system administrator and computer expert, Alexei secretly monitored her social media messages, which only fueled his jealousy further. Alexei Tatarkin could be described as emotionally unstable, and any concern he showed for Ekaterina was just an act. The investigation also revealed that Alexei didn't have a college degree at all. He hadn't even finished one course of study, and he had never served in the military, let alone in Chechnya, as he had claimed. The entire criminal case was documented in 7 thick volumes, containing testimony from dozens of witnesses, results from multiple forensic reports, and descriptions of investigative actions. To recap, Ekaterina Gurova disappeared on the night of May 27th last year. For a month and a half, not only her family and the police, but also teams of volunteers searched for her, combing through nearby forests, checking basements, and exploring abandoned buildings. From the court verdict, one witness stated, Tatarkin constantly picked fights and argued with Gurova. Before they got married, Gurova had decided to withdraw her marriage application, and in response, Tatarkin attempted suicide. In February 2012, Gurova left Tatarkin and started living separately. In early May, Tatarkin pretended to have a stroke. Their divorce hearing was scheduled for June 6, 2012. Gorova trusted Tatarkin to handle her loan payments. From Tatarkin's own testimony, I put the body parts in trash bags and carried them to my car, a Vaz 21053. Then I drove to the village of Nechkino. I took the bags with Gorova's body parts from the trunk and tried to sink them in the river, but they wouldn't sink. I tied bags of bricks with rope to the torso, but they came loose. After that, I drove from Nechkino back toward Izhevsk. When he returned to the apartment, Tatarkin cleaned the floors and wiped away the blood. He gathered the blood-stained items in a bag and, along with the rest of the body parts in other bags, placed them back in the car. At that moment, he noticed a message had popped up on Gorova's laptop from one of her friends. Pretending to be Ekaterina, he replied that she had supposedly gone out of town for a drive. To create an alibi for himself, the killer also sent 2 text messages from her phone to his own, saying that Katia was asking him not to worry and that she would definitely call him back the next day. From the testimony of the accused, Tatarkin, I left the torso in a wooded area on the left side of the road. I covered the bags with leaves but didn't bury them. The bags were about 30 yards apart. I left the sweater I was wearing at the time of the crime there as well. Then I drove to Zavielovo onto the Serapolsky highway, and after reaching the sign for Stary Choltum, I turned right and buried the remaining body parts along with the clothes. As the witness statements were being read in court, Ekaterina's mother, Olga, became overwhelmed. Unable to contain her sobs, she had to step out into the hallway where paramedics were called for her. The judge took nearly an hour and a half to read the verdict. Alexei Tatarkin was sentenced to 9 years and 6 months in a maximum security penal colony. The prosecutor had requested a 10-year sentence. There was no appeal. Neither Ekaterina Gurova's family lawyer nor her mother was present for the sentencing. None of Alexei's relatives attended either. Attached to the criminal case was a claim for damages, where Ekaterina's mother requested 5 million rubles for emotional distress. She also submitted documents seeking reimbursement for funeral expenses totaling 30,000 rubles. The court approved reimbursement of funeral expenses. However, regarding the 5 million rubles in emotional compensation, the court suggested that Ekaterina's mother file a separate civil lawsuit. As the verdict was being read, Alexei Tatarkin's face remained expressionless. The one thing he seemed relieved about was that Katia had stopped appearing in his dreams. It's heartbreaking to think of this wonderful woman who never got the chance to escape from the monster she married. With her kind and hopeful nature, Ekaterina saw light where there was only darkness, and she failed to see the evil in Alexei. Maybe the problem is that from a young age women are told they absolutely need a man by their side, that without him they're somehow incomplete. This mindset leads to a kind of self-esteem that makes it easy to end up married to whoever comes along. How little must she have valued herself to let a man stay in her life who couldn't even buy her flowers with his own money and had to steal from her purse? Why are we, as women, so blind? Katia realized early on that he was a phony, not a real man. A loving man would protect his woman, would make her happy with even the smallest gifts, just to see her smile. But by then, Katia was already trapped in his snare, one she couldn't escape alive. In 2022, Alexei Tatarkin was released and returned to Izhevsk. So much for justice. But we're not the ones who write the laws or make the decisions. What we can do is learn from stories like this. This case should serve as a warning to beautiful, successful women, those who are so confident in themselves and the goodness of the world that they end up choosing someone who seems like a devoted servant, a reliable partner, a simple guy who manages to worm his way into your life. You trust him with everything, your children, your property, thinking he's so loyal. But sooner or later, that same guy will stab you in the back because deep down, he knows he'll never reach or experience the success you have, and that realization will eat away at his ego, slowly and painfully. Justice comes from above, and sooner or this criminal will face it. Thanks for watching, guys. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel. There are a lot of shocking stories coming up. Story 5. Imagine a quiet, close-knit community where everyone seems to know each other, and crime is a rare occurrence. Sarah Starr, a teacher, a caring mother, and a dedicated member of her local church, was always smiling, always attentive to those around her. But one morning, she simply vanished, and just a few hours later, she was found lifeless in her own driveway. 2 shots from a shotgun ended her life in an instant. But here's the strange part. The main suspect was her ex-husband, Jason. Witnesses claimed he had threatened her, but he insisted on his innocence, even presenting a rock-solid alibi. So what's really going on here? Could someone else have been involved in this tragic twist of fate? Why did the authorities continue to suspect him despite the lack of direct evidence? Today, we'll dive into a complex investigation that spans several years. You'll discover the secrets hidden behind the facade of this seemingly perfect town, and learn just how far desperation and a thirst for revenge can push someone. Are you ready to uncover the truth about what really happened to Sarah Starr? It all started on November 27, 2017. On a sunny morning around 9 a.m., the emergency services of Coffee County, Alabama, received a distressing call. The man on the line spoke calmly, but his words left no doubt. He reported that his acquaintance, Sarah Starr, had likely taken her own life. Officers immediately rushed to the scene, a small house owned by the local church. This house, originally built to house the pastor, had been rented out for years only to church members. Sarah Starr, a woman with a complicated past, had been living there under special terms provided by the church. The home had become her refuge after enduring a 2-year-long divorce process, leaving her alone with her 4 children. She was 38 years old, trying to start fresh, far from the painful memories and conflicts of her past. Sarah was born in the small town of Colby, Kansas, in 1979. People always saw her as talented and caring, especially when it came to children. She chose to become a teacher, graduating from college and starting her career at a local school. Teaching literature and writing, she easily connected with her students, and many described her as a positive and attentive educator. Her marriage to Jason began back in 2001. At that time, she was 22 and had just earned her bachelor's degree in education. Jason was 6 years older and had recently returned from the military. Their relationship seemed harmonious. Both dreamed of building a family and appeared to be happy. But, as is often the case, trouble was brewing behind the scenes. At first, their marriage seemed peaceful. The couple settled in Colby, where they welcomed a set of twins, followed by another set 5 years later. However, Jason struggled with the responsibilities of fatherhood. He became increasingly irritable, snapping at Sarah over the noise of the kids, the constant mess, and lack of sleep. With each passing year, his frustrations grew more pronounced, and he didn't hesitate to belittle her, even in front of others. Sarah tried to keep the peace, finding solace in her faith. She became a devoted member of the local Baptist church, which gradually became her second home. With her gentle nature and outgoing personality, she quickly made new friends. Sarah took up gardening and photography, immersing herself in hobbies to distract from the turmoil at home. In 2016, when her life seemed to be on steadier ground, Sarah started working as a 4th-grade teacher. She continued to be seen as a caring and friendly person, but behind that warm exterior lay hidden struggles. Jason, growing increasingly resentful of his role as a father of 4, became more aggressive, and the tension in their marriage escalated. After numerous attempts to save their relationship, Sarah finally decided to file for divorce. She moved out, leaving the house to Jason, and found refuge in a home offered by the church. Relocating to Alabama appeared to be her opportunity for a fresh start. However, the divorce process dragged on, and her financial situation worsened. According to Jason, Sarah began spending recklessly, which only added to her troubles. The move was supposed to mark the beginning of a new chapter for her, but it didn't go as smoothly as she had hoped. On the day she left Jason's house, Sarah invited 2 close friends, Dana and Lawrence, to help her with the move. They recalled how she was frantic, running around, forgetting things, and repeatedly going back and forth. Sarah's behavior seemed unstable, and Dana and Lawrence sensed she was afraid of something. Her main concern was that Jason might show up and cause trouble, and her fears weren't unfounded. Now a single mother, Sarah felt her life becoming increasingly difficult. Despite the support of her church, The loneliness and financial burdens weighed heavily on her. When Sarah and her children finally arrived at the new house provided by the church, Jason did indeed show up. He approached the front door, but Lawrence stood his ground, blocking him from entering. Sensing that confrontation wouldn't work in his favor, Jason eventually left. However, according to Lawrence, Sarah's reaction was as if she had seen a ghost. She was shaking and crying. She insisted that Jason had threatened her, and now her worst fears had come true. 2 years after that incident, the divorce process finally concluded. The court ruled that the children would be under shared custody between both parents. Jason was ordered to pay child and spousal support to Sarah, which significantly impacted his financial situation. He had to give up more than half of his income. Sarah continued living in the church-provided home, while Jason moved to another house nearby, where he stayed with his mother. The morning of November 27, 2017, started like any other, except for one crucial difference. Sarah didn't show up for work. Her colleagues, who knew her as an extremely punctual and responsible person, were immediately concerned. Sarah wasn't answering calls or reading messages, and her absence seemed completely out of character. One of her colleagues, worried, drove over to Sarah's house to check if everything was okay. When her colleague arrived, she found Sarah's lifeless body on the driveway. Several gunshot wounds, blood, all pointed to a violent act. Emergency services were called right away, but it was already too late for Sarah. Police arrived on the scene and initially considered the possibility of self-harm. But after examining the crime scene, they quickly realized this was an act of aggression. As it was later revealed, the shots were fired around 6:30 a.m. when Sarah was leaving her house. An unknown assailant, armed with a shotgun, had been waiting for her and fired at close range. The first shot hit her chest and the second her head. Neighbors heard the shots, but they didn't think much of it. In the rural area where hunters were common, such sounds weren't unusual. No one imagined they were hearing Sarah's final moments. Forensics experts arrived at the scene but found no fingerprints or tire tracks. The perpetrator had been careful. However, knowing about the recent divorce and the tense relationship between Sarah and her ex-husband, the police's suspicions naturally turned toward Jason. The first people detectives spoke with were Sarah's friends, Dana and Lawrence. They confirmed that the last few months had been particularly hard for Sarah. She often expressed her fear of Jason, and even suggested that he might go to extreme lengths to get back at her. Their statements added tension to the investigation. Sarah's ex-husband, Jason, lived just a few minutes' walk from her home, giving him enough time to arrive there in the early morning and leave undetected afterward. Detectives, suspicious of Jason, continued to dig into the sequence of events, increasingly focusing on his potential involvement. However, when they brought him in for questioning, Jason insisted on his innocence, claiming that he was having breakfast at a cafe with his kids at the time of the crime. Surveillance footage and witness testimonies backed up his alibi, yet the detectives remained reluctant to rule him out. His motives were clear: a messy divorce, child support, and financial obligations that had become a major strain on his budget. Sarah's friends and family repeatedly told police that she was afraid of Jason. They were convinced that if anyone could have gone to such extremes, it was him. However, the police had no direct evidence linking him to the crime. Several press conferences were held, with authorities urging the public to come forward with any information that might help solve the case. The state's governor even announced a $5,000 reward for information leading to the arrest of the perpetrator, and a local resident added another $500 to the sum. Despite the police's efforts and widespread publicity, the investigation stalled. The case went cold for several years, and it wasn't until December 2021 that detectives regained momentum after receiving new information. They became convinced that Jason might have been involved indirectly, possibly by hiring someone to carry out the crime. He had a strong motive. After the divorce, he was required to pay child support that amounted to more than half of his income, which had become a serious financial burden. When detectives began examining Jason's digital records, they found something curious on his computer: notes that he seemed to be writing as if for a book. In these entries, he detailed his thoughts about his relationship with Sarah, the perceived injustice of the court's decision, and his resentment toward paying child support. The texts contained derogatory remarks about women, further deepening the police's suspicions. The detectives also reviewed his financial transactions leading up to the crime and uncovered several unusual payments. Between September 7th and November 15th, 2017, Jason transferred $2,600 to a woman named Lily. It turned out she was a friend of Jason's brother, Darren. What made this even more suspicious was that no previous transfers had ever taken place between them, and according to Lily, they barely knew each other until then. When detectives questioned Lily, they discovered that Jason had given his brother a 2016 motorcycle, an expensive vehicle, supposedly for repairs after an accident. He claimed the bike needed major work, costing around $5,000, and arranged to send money to his brother through Lily, in small amounts. This struck detectives as odd. Why would Jason, who was already struggling financially, suddenly decide to gift his brother such an expensive item? And why was he using Lily, a woman he barely knew, to facilitate these transactions? Detectives suspected that Jason and Darren might have been disguising these payments as repair costs, but they could have actually been payments related to the crime. They began closely monitoring Darren. Darren, a rough and solitary man, had lived most of his life in a trailer in Texas and kept to himself. He'd had past run-ins with the law, once for speeding, during which he was found with illegal substances. The detectives decided to check the brothers' communications, including text messages and phone calls. They seized their phones and uncovered some crucial details. It turned out that before Thanksgiving 2017, Darren had indeed traveled to Coffee County, Alabama. He arrived on November 18th and stayed in the area for 10 days, with his phone frequently pinging near Sarah's house. The night before the crime, his phone was switched off around midnight, which raised suspicions. It wasn't turned back on until 10 a.m. the next morning, by which time he was already back in Texas. This suggested that Darren might have deliberately tried to hide his whereabouts during the time of the crime. That same day, in the evening, Darren sent Jason a text message that appeared coded. He mentioned a successful deer hunt. Police believed the brothers were using coded language to communicate. One of Sarah's neighbors recalled seeing a motorcycle matching Darren's near Sarah's home. This distinctive bike had been spotted by other residents in the area before the incident, but no one thought much of it at the time. Another critical piece of evidence emerged when detectives reviewed footage from a surveillance camera on a shed near Sarah's home. The camera captured a motorcycle matching Darren's bike's description, leaving the area just minutes after the gunshots were heard. December 2021 became a turning point in the investigation. Armed with enough evidence, the police charged Jason and his brother Darren, suspecting them of conspiring to commit a crime. Jason was arrested first, and despite his defiant attitude and loud claims of innocence, he quickly requested a lawyer. However, his confidence was short-lived. Shortly after interrogations, he unexpectedly confessed to Sarah's death. Despite this confession, he was released on bail with the condition of wearing an electronic monitoring bracelet. When Darren learned of his brother's arrest, he went on the run. The police and FBI launched a manhunt, placing him on the most wanted list. An initial reward of $10,000 was offered for information leading to his capture, which was later increased to $22,000. Nearly 2 months later, on February 5, 2022, Darren turned himself in Texas. He denied any involvement, and unlike Jason, he refused to post bail, choosing instead to remain in jail until the trial. The hearings dragged on for months due to the abundance of circumstantial evidence and the lack of direct proof. Darren's attorney argued that there were no physical traces linking his client to the crime scene. He pointed out that the weapon used in the crime was never found, and that the surveillance footage was too unclear for a positive identification. He also emphasized that the absence of fingerprints and motorcycle tire tracks weakened the prosecution's case. In response, the prosecution presented evidence of the transactions between Jason and Lily, highlighting the financial transfers made in the months before and after the crime. They argued that these payments were for services rendered, and that the motorcycle given to Darren was used for the trip to Alabama. A crucial piece of evidence was the surveillance footage from the shed, which showed a motorcycle matching Darren's leaving the scene shortly after the crime. The prosecution insisted that the brothers used Lily to transfer money to conceal their tracks. When questioned in court, Lily stated that she was unaware of the brothers' intentions and was simply following their requests. All charges against her were eventually dropped, but her testimony played a key role in building the case against the brothers. The trial lasted several days, with each side attempting to sway the jury. Jason's lawyer emphasized the restaurant footage showing Jason with his children at the time of the crime as solid proof of his alibi. He also highlighted that Jason had voluntarily handed over his phone and computer to the police, which, he argued, was not typical behavior for someone trying to hide their involvement. Despite the defense's efforts, Jason's own confession, combined with the collected circumstantial evidence, convinced the jury. After 6 days of testimony and 6 hours of deliberation, the jury found both brothers guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. On January 4, 2024, Jason and Darren were sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. This verdict was seen as a form of mercy, as the nature of the crime could have led to the death penalty. But the jury could not reach a unanimous decision on that outcome. Jason has also been ordered to pay a fine of $25,000. Darren's attorney announced plans to appeal the verdict, while Jason's defense team opted not to, given his confession. As for the Star children, Sarah's parents have taken custody. During the trial, the older twins publicly renounced their father, stating they no longer wanted any contact with him. Both brothers remain in federal prison, and there is currently no confirmed information about the status or outcome of any potential appeals. This story is not just about jealousy and family conflicts. It's a reminder of how financial and emotional issues can spiral into tragedy. The most heartbreaking part is that the innocent children, whom Jason was supposed to protect, lost their mother at the hands of their own father and uncle. This case highlights the importance of recognizing signs of aggression and manipulation in relationships, and the painful reality that sometimes those closest to us can be more dangerous than we realize. Stories like this one prompt us to ask, how well do we truly know the people around us? Perhaps you or someone close to you is in a challenging relationship right now. Never ignore warning signs, because unfortunately, a story like Sarah's could happen to anyone. Take care of yourself, don't be afraid to seek help, and pay attention to the well-being of those you love. It's crucial to remember that even those we trust the most can pose a threat, and this case is a stark reminder of that. What are your thoughts on what happened? Can financial pressure and resentment ever justify such a monstrous act? Share your thoughts below, and tell us how you would handle a similar situation if you ever found yourself in one. Story 6. Perth, Western Australia, August 15, 2020, midnight. The suburb was shrouded in darkness, with only the occasional flicker of streetlights casting faint glows on the empty road. A house on the outskirts stood quiet and still, but inside there was a muffled commotion. In the dim light of a single lamp, weak shadows danced across the walls, accompanied by raised voices. It wasn't just an argument. It was something more, something intense and unsettling, almost primal in its ferocity. Suddenly, a loud crash shattered the air, as if something heavy had slammed against the wall. Then came the unmistakable sound of a gunshot. Time seemed to freeze. The silence that followed was deafening, filling the space like a thick fog. Outside the house, there wasn't a soul in sight. No one witnessed the scene, but the sharp crack of the firearm pierced the stillness of the night, as if slicing through it like a shard of glass. Minutes after the gunshot, Perth police received a frantic call to the emergency services. A woman's voice, trembling and panicked, reported a shooting and said someone had been injured. "He's not moving. Oh my God! Help!" the woman screamed, her voice breaking. The dispatcher immediately sent a patrol unit, and officers arrived at the scene within minutes. The flashing lights revealed a woman standing on the front lawn, visibly shaken. She was pale, her eyes wide with terror, and her whole body trembled uncontrollably. Inside the house, chaos awaited the officers. In the living room lay the body of James Watson, 38 years old. His body was twisted in an unnatural position, his eyes wide open, and a dark pool of blood had begun spreading across the floor. The blood soaked into the carpet, staining the furniture and walls. The officers quickly noticed signs of a struggle. Chairs were overturned, and there were clear marks of impact on both the furniture and the walls. The entire room was in disarray, pointing to a violent confrontation before the shot was fired. Next to the body lay a shotgun, its barrel pointed towards the door. At first glance, it seemed like someone had broken into the house, but there were no signs of forced entry. Officers cordoned off the area and called for detectives and forensic teams to collect evidence. It was clear to them that this wasn't just a random crime. There was something far more complex behind it. The woman they found on the lawn was identified as Catherine Watson, James' wife. She was in shock, and paramedics on the scene tried to calm her down. Her hands were covered in blood, and she was too distraught to speak coherently. When she was brought to the police station, all she could say was, "I didn't mean to. I didn't know it would end like this." Investigators began their search for answers. The first step was questioning the neighbors, but no one had heard anything unusual before the gunshot. One neighbor, an elderly man named Mark Ridley, mentioned that he saw Catherine and James returning home together that evening. They looked tense, but he didn't think much of it. Police took down his statement, though it didn't provide any significant leads. Meanwhile, forensic experts inside the house uncovered more and more evidence, suggesting that the conflict had started long before the gunshot. On the kitchen table, they found an open envelope. Inside were several documents and photographs. At first, they didn't seem particularly important, but upon closer inspection, the investigators noticed that some of the photos captured personal moments from the family's life. These images could potentially hold the key to understanding the motive behind the incident. Detectives worked to piece together the events of that evening. Around 8 p.m., Catherine and James returned home after a tense dinner at a restaurant. According to those who knew them, the dinner had been uncomfortable, but nothing had hinted at the coming tragedy. At one point, James mentioned that he needed to leave and take care of something, but Catherine insisted he stay. She told him there was something they needed to discuss. When they got back home, Catherine suggested they relax with a drink and spend the evening quietly. She left James in the living room and went upstairs, taking the envelope with her. James, seemingly unaware of what was coming, stayed downstairs. Catherine eventually came back down the stairs, holding the documents tightly in her hands, her face expressionless. She placed the envelope on the table in front of him and stood there, waiting for his reaction. James saw the envelope and his expression changed. He tried to remain calm, but the tension in the room was undeniable. Catherine didn't say a word, but the look in her eyes spoke volumes. A heavy silence hung in the air. This was the moment when everything shifted. A heated argument erupted between them, escalating quickly into a shouting match. At one point, James tried to grab the envelope, but Catherine held onto it, refusing to let go of the documents. As investigators examined the room where the shot was fired, they discovered a broken chair that appeared to have been used as a weapon. Scattered across the floor were papers and photographs, some of which were stained with blood. All the evidence pointed to a struggle over the documents between James and Catherine. Detectives concluded that the shot was fired at the moment when James was trying to take something from Catherine. It was clear from the marks on the carpet and the position of the shotgun that Catherine had pulled the trigger. When police accessed James and Catherine's phones, they uncovered several intriguing details. James' phone had been turned off at 10:30 p.m., which was unusual considering his typical behavior. Surveillance footage from a camera outside their house confirmed that James had left around that time, but returned just 10 minutes later. What he did during those few minutes remained a mystery. Catherine, still in shock when she was brought to the station, couldn't provide a clear explanation of what had transpired. According to her, they had started arguing, and at some point things spiraled out of control. She claimed not to remember how she ended up holding the shotgun. Detectives noted the stress she was clearly under, but they also sensed there was more to her story. Investigators began digging deeper into the Watsons' relationship. The couple had been married for 10 years, had no children, and outwardly appeared to have a calm life. However, neighbors pointed out that James had been spending less time at home in recent months, which had raised suspicions for Catherine. No one knew the exact nature of what was going on between them, but the tension in their interactions hadn't gone unnoticed by close friends and neighbors. The investigation also revealed that just a week before the incident, Catherine had contacted a private investigator. The reasons for this were unclear. Perhaps she was gathering evidence against her husband, but exactly what she was investigating was still unknown. Later that evening, police received the results of the forensic analysis of the weapon found at the scene. James' fingerprints were discovered on the shotgun, but they seemed odd, like he had only handled it briefly. This led detectives to wonder, could someone else have used the weapon in the critical moment? The morning after the incident, Perth police returned to Catherine and James Watson's home. The crime scene remained sealed off, with forensic teams continuing to gather evidence, while detectives worked to piece together a clearer picture of what had occurred. On the surface, it appeared to be a sudden outburst of aggression during an argument, but the details raised doubts about the simplicity of this explanation. Detective Richard Hale, leading the investigation, decided to review the surveillance footage again to make sure nothing had been overlooked. The footage showed James leaving the house at 10:30 p.m. and returning 10 minutes later, but there was a small inconsistency between the frames. The video showed him speaking with someone in a car parked by the curb. The camera captured a shadowy figure, but the face of the person James was talking to was indistinguishable. Hale realized this might be a crucial lead and began investigating who could have been outside the house at that moment. Meanwhile, detectives continued their second round of questioning with Catherine, but her mental state remained unstable. She insisted that she couldn't recall how things escalated and claimed everything happened too quickly. Her words were jumbled, and her eyes appeared vacant. However, Detective Hale noticed a brief change in her expression when he asked about the car seen on the surveillance footage, as if she was trying to hide something. At the same time, investigators were thoroughly examining the contents of the envelope found at the scene. Inside were indeed several photographs taken by a private investigator. The photos showed James with a young woman, but her face was always obscured. The report from the investigator detailed several places where they had met: a cafe in downtown Perth, a shopping mall parking lot, and a motel on the outskirts of the city. However, the woman's name wasn't mentioned in the report. Hale concluded that Catherine had hired the private investigator to follow her husband, but how these photographs tied into the crime was still unclear. Investigators decided to visit the office of the private investigator mentioned in the report. They found him, a man named Thomas Morgan, who looked somewhat uneasy when he saw the detectives. Morgan confirmed that Catherine had contacted him about 2 weeks prior, saying her husband had been acting suspiciously. She suspected he was being unfaithful, but didn't provide many details. Morgan showed the detectives copies of the photos taken during a week of surveillance. The images clearly showed James meeting with the woman, though her face was always hidden. She was either turning away or wearing a hood. Morgan claimed he had handed over all the gathered material to Catherine just a day before the tragic event. Detective Hale returned to Catherine and showed her the photos taken by the private investigator. Her reaction remained emotionless, but she admitted that she had suspected James of being unfaithful. She said she intended to confront him with the evidence at a family discussion to find out the truth and decide the future of their marriage. However, she maintained that she never meant to harm him. According to her, things spiraled out of control when James saw the photos and accused her of spying on him. She claimed that the argument turned into a physical struggle and, eventually, the fatal shot. But she couldn't remember exactly how it happened. As detectives tried to determine whether Catherine's account was truthful, they received the forensic results on the fingerprints found on the shotgun. While James's prints were indeed present, forensic experts determined they had been placed on the gun well before the shot was fired. Catherine had claimed the gun was kept in the house for protection and insisted she had never touched it. This statement contradicted the forensic findings, and investigators began to suspect that someone had tampered with the weapon in an attempt to mislead the police. The surveillance footage of James talking to someone in a car became a key piece of evidence. Detective Hale sent a copy of the recording for further analysis, hoping to identify the car's license plate and figure out who might have been outside the Watsons' home that evening. While waiting for the results, detectives reviewed Catherine and James's phone records, searching for additional clues. They discovered that on the night of the incident, Catherine had sent several text messages to her sister Lisa. The content of the messages raised suspicions. They seemed like attempts to explain or justify something. One message read, "I didn't mean for it to happen this way." Another contained a request to meet. Lisa hadn't replied to these messages, which alarmed Hale. He decided to call her in for questioning to find out if she knew anything about that night's events. When Lisa arrived at the station, she appeared tense. She confirmed that she had spoken with Catherine the day before, but not on the night of the incident. According to Lisa, they had discussed an upcoming family gathering. She claimed to know nothing about what had happened and said she had been home the entire evening. However, her nervous demeanor and hesitant answers raised red flags for the detectives. Hale decided to check her phone records and location data to verify her alibi. While the questioning continued, investigators received the results from the analysis of the surveillance video. The license plate on the car parked outside the Watsons' house belonged to Lisa. This revelation heightened their suspicions, and Hale changed his approach during the interrogation, asking Lisa direct questions about her whereabouts that night. At first, she tried to make excuses, but under pressure, she finally admitted that she had been outside the house when James stepped out. Her explanation, however, was confusing. She claimed she had come to talk to her sister, but decided to leave after seeing James, without ever getting out of the car. Hale knew something didn't add up. He returned to analyzing Lisa's phone records and discovered that on the night of the incident, she had received a message from James, urging her to come over immediately. But why would James call Lisa when he was supposed to be with Catherine, and what could they have been discussing privately? Meanwhile, forensic experts found another crucial piece of evidence. In the bedroom where Catherine said the argument began, they discovered traces of blood on the door handle that didn't match Catherine or James. This led detectives to suspect that a third person had been present during the conflict. A DNA analysis confirmed that the blood belonged to Lisa. Now, investigators had proof that Lisa had been inside the house, despite her previous denials. The police confronted Lisa with the new evidence. She tried to defend herself, claiming she had only come to protect Catherine. But when the argument between James and Catherine started, she panicked and tried to leave. She insisted she had no involvement in the crime and didn't know who fired the shot. However, her story became increasingly tangled as the questioning continued. Detectives were beginning to suspect that Catherine and Lisa might be hiding something. They had a theory that James' possible affair could have triggered a conflict between the sisters, but there were still too many unanswered questions. Hale decided to temporarily let Lisa go, asking her not to leave town. He sensed they were close to solving the mystery, but one key piece of evidence was still missing to fully uncover the truth about that night. The next day, Detective Richard Hale and his team returned to the Watson home for a more thorough inspection. With each new clue, it became clear that this wasn't a simple crime. Hale felt there was much more beneath the surface than just a family argument that ended in tragedy. The police combed through every room again, checking for details that might shed more light on the case. They closely examined the photographs found in the envelope. The detectives believed the private investigator's photos, commissioned by Catherine, were central to the motive, but the woman's face in the pictures remained blurred and hidden. This complicated the investigation, as they couldn't definitively identify her. While the forensic team continued their work, Hale decided to bring Lisa back in for questioning, this time not as a witness, but as a potential suspect. Lisa appeared nervous, but agreed to cooperate. Hale chose to use a more direct approach, presenting her with the results of the blood analysis found on the door handle. He asked her why her blood was found inside the house if she had claimed she never got out of her car. Lisa once again tried to explain, but her answers were unconvincing. She suggested she might have accidentally scratched herself while entering the house, but her story seemed flimsy. Hale realized that pushing further wouldn't be productive and decided to give her some time, though he was certain there was more to her story than she was letting on. Meanwhile, investigators analyzed Lisa and James' phone records. They found several messages James had sent to Lisa just before his death. One text read, "Come over immediately," while another specified the location for a meeting. The messages had an urgent, almost desperate tone, leading Hale to believe that James had a sense something serious was about to happen. He instructed his team to dig deeper into their past interactions to see if there had been other similar meetings or communications. Detectives also began reviewing James' emails and social media accounts. They uncovered a string of messages between James and Lisa dating back several weeks. In these exchanges, James and Lisa discussed some serious steps that needed to be taken soon. The messages hinted at a plan, but the specifics were vague. Hale started to piece together that there was more to the relationship between James and Lisa than just a family bond. As the investigation gained momentum, Catherine remained in a state of stress. Detectives decided to return to her for further questioning, hoping to clarify the events of that night. Hale began asking about her relationship with Lisa, but Catherine was reluctant to discuss her sister. She mentioned that they had been close, but their relationship had deteriorated in recent months. Catherine didn't go into details, but hinted that conflicts had arisen in their family, not all of which involved James. Sensing an opportunity, Hale pressed harder, asking if Catherine knew that James had been meeting with Lisa. He showed her messages from James' phone, but her reaction remained neutral. She claimed she had no knowledge of these meetings, and that her only suspicion was about James possibly being unfaithful with another woman, but not with Lisa. At that moment, Hale realized that either Catherine truly knew nothing, or she was deliberately hiding the truth. Shifting their focus, the detectives decided to investigate Lisa's home. They obtained a search warrant and headed to her residence to gather more evidence. During the search, they found a notebook filled with notes about meetings and phone calls with James. The entries included names, dates, and addresses, one of which was Catherine and James' home. This confirmed that Lisa was not only aware of James' every move, but may have been planning her visits. Hale began to suspect that Lisa played a central role in what had happened. Further digging revealed a photograph in Lisa's house, showing her and James together at the beach. The picture appeared to be recent, and they looked quite close. This became a critical lead. Hale now realized that James and Lisa had a romantic relationship, one that Catherine either hadn't suspected or had intentionally ignored. Meanwhile, forensic experts completed their analysis of the shotgun. The results indicated that Lisa's fingerprints were indeed on the weapon, but they were left after James' prints. This led detectives to believe that Lisa had handled the shotgun after James was already injured. Hale began to suspect that Lisa might have tampered with the crime scene to mislead the investigation. At the same time, investigators uncovered footage from a hotel where James and Lisa had met. The video showed them talking, discussing something, before Lisa left and James stayed behind. Their behavior was intimate, providing further proof of a relationship that Catherine was unaware of. This strengthened the theory that Lisa and James were involved in something deeper, and that their secret connection had played a major part in the events leading to that tragic night. Hale decided to act quickly. He summoned Lisa back to the station and this time presented her with the new evidence, photos, videos, and fingerprints. Lisa tried to remain composed, but under pressure, she began to crack. She admitted that she had indeed been seeing James behind Catherine's back. She explained that their affair had started over a year ago, but she never intended to destroy her sister's marriage. Everything was kept secret until Catherine began suspecting James of infidelity and hired a private investigator. Hale pressed further, asking what Lisa and James discussed that night. Lisa claimed that James had wanted to meet, to talk about how best to confess the truth to Catherine. But things quickly got out of control. She confessed that she had come to the house but hadn't intended to interfere. However, when she heard the shouting, she entered the house and saw Catherine and James struggling. According to her, she tried to stop them but didn't make it in time. Detectives began verifying her story, but all the evidence pointed to Lisa being inside the house at the time of the crime. Surveillance footage, blood analysis, and fingerprints all confirmed her presence. The question remained, was she directly involved in the confrontation, or merely a witness? But Hale was certain she was hiding more than she was letting on. Meanwhile, investigators examined James and Lisa's financial records. They discovered that shortly before the incident, James had transferred a large sum of money to Lisa's account. It seemed like payment for something, but the reason behind it remained unclear. Hale began to suspect that Lisa was involved in a plan, perhaps even orchestrating the crime. Later that evening, detectives received a breakthrough from the forensic team. They had found a phone belonging to Lisa, hidden under the mattress in Catherine and James's bedroom. When the detectives accessed the phone, they uncovered text messages that confirmed their suspicions. James and Lisa had been planning to stage an attack and frame Catherine for it. The messages discussed various details of the plan, but for some reason, things didn't go as intended. Hale realized they now had enough evidence to arrest Lisa. He ordered her detainment, and during a subsequent interrogation, Lisa, backed into a corner, admitted that there had indeed been a plan. She claimed that James had threatened to expose her if she didn't help him get rid of Catherine. However, she insisted that the shooting was an accident, and that she never intended for things to go this far. Hale knew he was close to solving the case, but one key question remained. If Lisa and James had planned everything together, why did the plan fall apart, and who actually pulled the trigger? Detective Richard Hale felt like the pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together, but one crucial question still lingered. Who had really pulled the trigger, and why had James and Lisa's plan gone wrong? The gathered evidence and Lisa's confession pointed to a conspiracy, but the full details were still unclear. In the interrogation room, Lisa continued to insist that she had no part in the crime and never intended to harm James. She tried to convince the detectives that their original plan was only to stage an incident that would make it look like Catherine had attacked James. But when the situation escalated, things spiraled out of control. According to her, when the struggle began, she found herself on the sidelines, unsure of what to do. Hale listened carefully, but he could tell that Lisa was still withholding something. He decided to launch one final review of the case to reconstruct the entire sequence of events from that night. The detectives returned to the Watson home, carefully reviewing surveillance footage and re-examining the crime scene to ensure they hadn't missed anything. During the re-examination, forensic experts uncovered a small but significant clue on the shotgun that had previously gone unnoticed. A strand of hair was found under the stock, and tests revealed it belonged to Catherine. This discovery gave Hale pause. Perhaps Catherine had held the gun either before or right after the shot was fired. It also explained why her account had been so confused. Maybe she genuinely couldn't remember how things unfolded in those critical moments when emotions ran high. The detectives also reviewed Catherine's phone records from just before the shooting. They discovered that she had contacted the private investigator she had hired and arranged a meeting for the next day. This confirmed that she had serious intentions of confronting the situation and possibly holding James accountable for his infidelity. But if she had these plans, why had the situation escalated into a tragedy? Hale decided to revisit Catherine's statements. His goal was to determine whether she had been manipulated or if she had been involved in the conflict from the start. He began questioning her more assertively, but Catherine still claimed she couldn't recall the exact details. She described how she and James started arguing and how he tried to take the envelope with the photos from her. Everything happened too fast, and at some point everything just went dark. As the investigation progressed, detectives gained access to a security camera in the living room that they had initially missed. It turned out James had installed the camera himself, providing an unexpected twist in the case. The footage showed Catherine and James arguing. Lisa didn't appear on camera, but her voice could be heard. She was pleading with James to stop and saying they needed to resolve things peacefully. At one point, James tried to snatch the envelope from Catherine's hands, and she pushed him away, sparking a physical struggle. The video showed Catherine losing control of the situation. James grabbed her wrists, and at that moment, Lisa ran into the room, attempting to break up the fight. She positioned herself between them, but somehow ended up holding the shotgun. It appeared she intended to de-escalate the situation, but things didn't go as planned. The video captured the crucial moment when Lisa, in a state of panic, unintentionally pointed the shotgun at James in an attempt to scare him. James made a sudden move, and that's when the gun went off. Catherine collapsed to the floor as Lisa stood frozen, the shotgun still in her hands. For several seconds, she stared at James lying motionless on the ground, her face contorted in pure horror. Slowly, she lowered the shotgun and ran out of the frame. Catherine, trembling and in shock, slowly got up and frantically dialed emergency services, her voice shaky and panicked. Detective Hale now understood what had happened. Lisa, caught in the middle of the escalating conflict, had fired the shot in a moment of sheer panic, likely not even realizing what she was doing. The plan that James and Lisa had concocted to stage an attack and pin the blame on Catherine had backfired. When the situation reached its breaking point, Lisa, overwhelmed by fear, lost control, and the tragedy became inevitable. Hale decided to conclude the case by charging Lisa with involuntary manslaughter. She broke down in tears, insisting that she never intended to cause harm, but the evidence was undeniable. The investigators recognized that, while her actions stemmed from panic, she had been aware she was holding a firearm and could have chosen not to use it. When Catherine learned the full truth, she remained in shock. She realized that her sister wasn't just a participant in the scheme, but the one whose actions had ultimately led to James' death. Despite her grief, Catherine agreed to cooperate with the investigation, providing all the necessary evidence to help the police bring the case to a close. In the end, Lisa pleaded guilty in court and was sentenced to 6 years in prison for involuntary manslaughter and conspiracy to stage a crime. Catherine left Perth to start a new life, determined to leave behind the tragic events that had forever altered her family. The story ended far differently than any of its participants had planned. Secret affairs, deception, and manipulation spiraled into a tragedy born from poor decisions and lost control. As the rain falls and the night deepens, thank you for being here with me at Radio Night Crime. True crime stories remind us of life's mysteries and the need to stay aware, even in the stillness of the night. If you enjoyed tonight's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let the sound of the rain lull you to sleep, and until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and let the night keep you company.